I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I was at the grocery store, picking up a few things for dinner after a long day. The store was quiet, with only a handful of people moving through the aisles. It was late, close to 9 in the evening, and I had deliberately chosen this time because the store was usually less crowded. After gathering my items, I made my way to the checkout counter, tired but glad to be heading home soon. The cashier, a young man who looked to be in his early 20s, gave me a polite nod as he started scanning my groceries. I watched him work, placing my items in bags with an efficiency that came from experience. The beeping of the scanner was the only sound between us, and I barely noticed when he paused for a moment, glancing up at me with an unreadable expression. I assumed he was distracted or perhaps just tired, much like I was. He continued scanning the rest of my items without a word, and I pulled out my wallet, ready to pay. It was an ordinary, uneventful transaction until he handed me my receipt. His hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary as he passed the receipt to me, and then he leaned slightly forward. His voice was barely above a whisper, but I heard him clearly. "Be careful," he said, his tone laced with an urgency that sent a chill down my spine. I froze for a moment, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "What?" I asked, my voice coming out more startled than I intended. He didn't respond right away, only meeting my eyes for a brief second before looking away. I glanced around, wondering if anyone else had noticed the interaction, but no one seemed to be paying attention. The store was quiet, and the other cashiers were busy with their own customers. "What do you mean?" I asked again, my voice quieter this time, almost hesitant. He shook his head slightly, avoiding my gaze as he began scanning the next customer's items. It was as if the moment had passed, and he didn't want to elaborate. I felt a surge of unease as I picked up my bags and moved toward the exit. His words were playing in my mind. Outside, the parking lot was dimly lit, and a light drizzle had begun to fall. I walked briskly to my car, glancing over my shoulder more than once. The words "be careful" echoed in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Was he warning me about something specific? Did he know something I didn't? Or was it just a harmless comment? Perhaps even a misunderstanding? The possibilities swirled in my mind as I unlocked my car and got inside, locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the receipt in my hand. I turned it over, half expecting to find a note or some kind of clue scribbled on it, but there was nothing unusual. It was just a standard receipt with the list of items I had purchased and the total at the bottom. I felt foolish for letting it bother me so much, but there was something about the way he had said it, the urgency in his voice, that made it impossible to ignore. The drive home was uneventful, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. Every car that passed me on the road seemed to linger a moment too long, and every shadow along the sidewalk seemed to shift in the corners of my vision. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Home was my safe place, and I was eager to put this strange encounter behind me. I carried my groceries inside, locking the door behind me and double-checking that all the windows were secure. As I unpacked the bags, I couldn't help but glance out the window every few minutes, my mind still racing with possibilities. I told myself that I was overreacting, that the cashier's words were probably nothing more than a strange choice of phrase. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something more. I finished putting everything away and settled into my usual evening routine. trying to distract myself with television and the comfort of my familiar surroundings. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I debated whether I should go back to the store and ask the cashier what he meant, but the idea felt absurd. What would I say? That his words had unsettled me to the point of obsession. I knew I would sound ridiculous, and there was no guarantee he would even be working that day. Instead, I decided to let it go, convincing myself that it was nothing to worry about. But as the day went on, small things began to unnerve me. I noticed a car parked across the street from my house, one I hadn't seen before. It was an old, beat-up sedan, and it didn't seem to belong to any of my neighbors. At first, I dismissed it, assuming it was someone visiting or perhaps just a coincidence. But as the hours passed, the car remained, and I started to feel uneasy. I tried to focus on other things, but my attention kept drifting back to the window where the car sat like an ominous presence. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner, I heard a strange noise outside. It was faint, like the sound of footsteps on gravel, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I went to the window and peered out, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The car was still there, though, its silhouette barely visible under the dim streetlights. I tried to tell myself that I was imagining things, that the cashier's words had planted a seed of paranoia in my mind. But the feeling of unease was impossible to ignore. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified, and I found myself listening intently for any signs of something out of the ordinary. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with unsettling images, shadowy figures lurking just out of sight, whispers that I couldn't quite make out, and the cashier's voice repeating those two words, "Be careful." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming. As the days went on, the feeling of unease began to fade, though it never completely disappeared. I stopped noticing the car parked across the street, and the strange noises outside became easier to ignore. Life returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after such an unsettling experience. But every now and then, I would think back to that moment in the store, to the cashier's whispered warning, and I would wonder what he had meant. Was it a random comment, or had he seen something that I hadn't? I may never know, but the memory of his words will always linger, a reminder that sometimes even the smallest interactions can leave a lasting impact. Story 2. It started on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling mindlessly on my phone while the soft hum of the television filled the room. Out of nowhere, everything went dark. The lights blinked off, the TV shut down, and the faint buzz of the refrigerator in the kitchen ceased. For a moment I froze, caught off guard by the sudden silence. I checked my phone and its screen was still lit, reassuring me that it wasn't a complete blackout in the area. The first thing I thought was that the outage might have been due to a trip breaker or something wrong with the wiring in the house. I reached for the flashlight in the drawer near the couch and made my way to the breaker box. As I was about to flip one of the switches, the power came back on by itself. 7 minutes. That was how long the outage had lasted. I shrugged it off, thinking it was an odd but isolated incident. The next night, at almost the exact same time, it happened again. I was in the middle of preparing dinner when the kitchen went dark. The sizzle of the pan abruptly stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My hands hovered over the countertop as I waited, unsure if it would come back on its own like the night before. Sure enough, after 7 minutes the power returned, as though nothing had happened. This time I felt a little uneasy. 2 nights in a row. It couldn't be a coincidence. By the third night I was on edge. I kept glancing at the clock as it crept closer to the time the outages had occurred. I had decided to keep track, noting down the exact minute it started and ended. When the lights went out again at the same time as the previous nights, my unease deepened. It wasn't just the outage itself, it was the precision of it. 7 minutes, no more, no less. I called the power company the next morning to report the issue. The customer service representative sounded genuinely puzzled when I explained the situation. "We don't have any scheduled outages in your area," they said. "It doesn't look like there are any ongoing maintenance activities either. Are you sure it's not an issue with your home's wiring?" I had already considered that possibility, but the pattern of the outages felt too deliberate to be a simple wiring problem. Still, I called an electrician to check everything. They spent hours inspecting the house, testing the circuits, and even replacing a few older components just to be safe. When they were done, they assured me everything was in working order. I felt a small sense of relief, but that relief didn't last. On the 4th night, I was ready. I sat on the couch with a flashlight in hand and my phone set to record the moment the outage began. I wanted proof that this wasn't just my imagination or a minor electrical issue. When the clock hit the usual time, the lights went out again. My phone's recording captured the abrupt darkness, and I sat there, counting the seconds. 7 minutes later, the power flickered back on, just as it had every other night. I replayed the video several times, trying to catch anything that could explain what was happening. But all I saw was the light disappearing and returning, nothing unusual beyond the timing itself. It was as if someone had flipped a switch off and on, deliberately and precisely. By the 5th night, the outages had started to wear on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I had no proof of it. The power outages were strange enough on their own, but they also made me hyper-aware of every creak and rustle in the house. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows twice, then a 3rd time for good measure. When the lights went out that night, I sat in the darkness, my breathing shallow and my ears straining for any sound out of place. The minutes dragged on, and the silence seemed heavier than before. When the power finally returned, I found myself sweating, my nerves on edge. Nothing else seemed out of order, but I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. On the 6th night, I stayed outside. I wanted to see if the outage was isolated to my house, or if it affected the whole neighborhood. I sat in my car parked across the street, the engine off and my eyes trained on my house. When the time came, I watched as the windows of my home went dark. But when I glanced at the houses around mine, I noticed their lights remained on. It was only my house. The realization made my stomach turn. That night, I hardly slept. I couldn't stop thinking about the deliberate nature of the outages and what they could mean. Was someone targeting me? Was there something wrong with the house that no one could explain? The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it as a bizarre coincidence, but the timing and precision were too exact to ignore. By the 7th night, I was exhausted. My nerves were frayed, and I felt like I was teetering on the edge of paranoia. I sat in the living room, my phone in hand, ready to call for help if anything unusual happened. When the lights went out, I waited in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. I counted the seconds, each one feeling longer than the last. At the 6-minute mark, I heard a faint sound. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like a whisper coming from somewhere in the house. My breath caught in my throat, and I strained to hear it again. The sound came once more, this time clearer, a faint creak, like footsteps on the floorboards. The power came back on a moment later, flooding the room with light. I shot to my feet, scanning the room for any sign of movement. Everything looked normal, but the sound had been real. I was sure of it. I checked every room, every corner, but found nothing out of place. Yet the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room, every light in the house turned on, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag and left, unsure of what was going on or if I would ever find out. All I knew was that I couldn't ignore the feeling that something or someone had been orchestrating the outages, and I wasn't willing to wait around to see what would happen next. Story 3. It was late in the evening when I finally decided to wind down for the night. The day had been uneventful, the kind where hours blend into each other without much to mark them. I stretched out on the couch, scrolling through my phone absent-mindedly, deleting old messages and clearing storage. That was when I noticed a voice memo that I did not remember making. The app displayed the timestamp from earlier that afternoon, a time I distinctly remembered being home alone, quietly working on my laptop. My curiosity piqued, and I pressed play. What I heard sent a shiver through my entire body. The voice was unmistakably mine. It started with a brief shuffle of noise, like the sound of fabric brushing against the microphone, followed by my voice speaking softly but clearly. "It is quiet here," it said, the tone calm, almost detached. "The time feels strange, like it is passing in a loop. I feel like I am being watched." I hit pause immediately, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't understand what I had just heard. It was undeniably my voice, but I had no memory of ever recording such a message. My mind raced to make sense of it. Was it some kind of prank? Had someone else somehow gained access to my phone and made the recording? Shaking off the initial wave of panic, I played the recording again. This time I listened to the whole thing. The message continued, my voice narrating in an eerie monotone. "The house feels different today. The air feels heavier. I thought I heard someone behind me, but when I turned around, no one was there." The message ended abruptly, cutting off mid-sentence. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. My hand was trembling, and I had to put the phone down for a moment to gather my thoughts. I replayed the day in my mind. I had been alone all afternoon typing away at my desk. The house had been silent, apart from the usual hum of appliances. There had been no interruptions, no visitors, no signs of anything unusual. How could I have recorded something like this without remembering? I checked the file properties, hoping to find some kind of clue. The recording was indeed created earlier that afternoon during a time when I was completely certain I had not touched my phone. I opened my call log and message history, looking for any signs of unusual activity, but everything seemed normal. The idea that someone had accessed my phone felt both far-fetched and deeply unsettling. My phone had been with me the entire day, and there was no evidence of tampering. Yet the voice memo was undeniably there, staring back at me like an unsolvable riddle. I sat on the couch, staring at the darkened screen, a growing sense of unease creeping over me. The words I had heard played over and over in my mind, each phrase feeling more ominous than the last. The part about being watched sent chills down my spine. I got up and walked around the house, checking the locks on every door and window. Everything was secure, just as it had been all day. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not as alone as I thought. The silence of the house now felt oppressive, almost as if it were pressing down on me. I returned to the couch and decided to try something. I opened the voice memo app and hit the record button, speaking into the phone to compare my voice to the one in the mysterious recording. "This is me," I said aloud. "I am speaking right now, and this is my voice." When I played it back, the sound was identical to the strange recording. There was no denying it, the voice in the memo was mine. Yet the words, the tone, The entire context felt alien. It was as though some other version of myself had spoken those words, someone I didn't know or remember being. I thought about deleting the recording, erasing the unsettling reminder of this unexplained event, but something stopped me. I needed answers, and deleting it felt like giving up on the chance to figure out what had happened. Instead, I saved it to a secure folder on my phone and decided to search online for anything similar. I typed in phrases like voice memos appearing on phone and recordings I didn't make. The search results were a mix of mundane tech glitches and bizarre paranormal theories. Some people claimed that stray radio frequencies could interfere with devices, causing strange recordings. Others wrote about theories of alternate realities or unexplained phenomena. None of it felt satisfying or plausible enough to explain what I had experienced. The hours stretched on as I sat there, scrolling through forums and articles, but I found no concrete answers. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I decided to call it a night. As I climbed into bed, the unease lingered. I locked my bedroom door and placed my phone on the nightstand, half expecting it to come to life with another mysterious recording. The next morning, I woke up to find my phone exactly where I had left it. There were no new recordings, no strange notifications, nothing out of the ordinary. For a moment, I wondered if the whole thing had been a dream. But when I checked the voice memo app, the recording was still there. It was real, no matter how much I wished it wasn't. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house, every shadow at the edge of my vision felt like a sign that something was amiss. I found myself constantly checking my phone, half hoping and half dreading that another strange recording would appear. But nothing did. The recording remained a mystery, a reminder of something I could not explain. It was a crack in the fabric of my otherwise ordinary life, a glimpse into something I did not understand and might never fully comprehend. Story 4. It was a typical morning at work, the kind where everything felt routine and predictable. I arrived at the office, set my bag down, and booted up my computer, ready to tackle the tasks ahead. As I settled into my chair, sipping my coffee, a coworker from the next cubicle leaned over with a grin on their face. "That was a good one," they said, their voice filled with amusement. I turned to them, puzzled. "What do you mean?" I asked, genuinely unsure what they were referring to. "The email," they replied, still chuckling. "The prank email you sent last night. It was hilarious." My confusion deepened. I hadn't sent any emails outside of work-related ones, and certainly not anything resembling a prank. My evenings were spent quietly at home, away from the chaos of the office. "I did not send any prank email," I said, my voice tinged with concern. They raised an eyebrow. "Come on, it had your name on it. You cannot deny it," they said, their tone teasing but with a hint of disbelief. I shook my head, feeling a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. "I am serious. I did not send anything like that." My coworker's smile faded slightly as they realized I was not joking. They straightened up and walked back to their desk, muttering something about showing me the email later. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to the mysterious email. I couldn't understand how it could have come from me. My work email was secure, or at least I thought it was. No one else had access to it, and I was meticulous about logging out when I left the office. Around lunchtime, my coworker returned with their phone in hand. "Here," they said, pulling up the email. "Take a look." "Oh." I leaned over to read it, and my stomach dropped. The email was indeed sent from my account. It was lighthearted, filled with jokes and a couple of playful jabs at our team's quirks. On the surface, it seemed harmless, but seeing my name attached to something I hadn't written left me feeling uneasy. "I swear I did not write this," I said firmly, handing the phone back. My coworkers studied me for a moment, their expression shifting from amusement to concern. "If you didn't, then who did?" they asked. That was the question I couldn't answer. I excused myself and returned to my desk, determined to figure out what had happened. I opened my email account and scanned through my sent folder. There it was, the prank email sent late last night. My heart sank. The timestamp confirmed that it had been sent long after I had left work and shut down my computer. I checked the email details, looking for anything unusual. The IP address matched the office network, which meant it had been sent from here. That did not make sense. No one had access to my computer, and I had not left it on overnight. The thought that someone might have used my account without my knowledge sent a chill down my spine. I immediately changed my password, ensuring it was more secure. Then, I reported the incident to our IT department. They assured me they would investigate and let me know if they found anything suspicious. I felt slightly better knowing they were looking into it, but the whole situation left me rattled. The rest of the day felt surreal. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had deliberately impersonated me, using my name and email to send that message. The jokes in the email were harmless enough, but the fact that it had been sent without my knowledge was deeply unsettling. Who would do such a thing, and why? Over the next few days, the IT team conducted their investigation. They found no signs of an external hack or unauthorized access. According to their findings, the email had been sent from my computer, but I knew that wasn't possible. I hadn't even been in the office at the time. The lack of answers only made the situation more confusing. Was it a prank by someone in the office, someone who had managed to bypass my security measures? Or was it something more sinister, a way to sow doubt and suspicion among the team? I couldn't tell, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. My coworkers seemed to forget about the incident quickly, brushing it off as a harmless joke. But for me, it was impossible to ignore. Every time I opened my email, I felt a pang of anxiety, wondering if something like this would happen again. I started double-checking everything, from my login credentials to the security settings on my computer. I even began locking my office drawer, just in case. But no matter how many precautions I took, I couldn't shake the feeling that my privacy had been violated. In the weeks that followed, nothing similar happened. The prank email remained an isolated incident, and the mystery of how it had been sent remained unsolved. But the experience left me wary, a reminder that even in a familiar, comfortable environment, things aren't always as secure as they seem. Story 5. Someone left a trail of breadcrumbs leading to my front door. It was strange and unsettling to see a deliberate line of small, scattered pieces stretching from the sidewalk to my doorstep. I froze for a moment, unsure whether to follow the trail or sweep it away without a second thought. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground, and the sight felt like something out of a bizarre story. I glanced around to see if anyone was nearby, but the street was eerily empty, the only sounds coming from distant birds and the faint rustling of leaves. I crouched down to examine the breadcrumbs more closely, trying to piece together the intention behind this odd gesture. The crumbs were fresh, soft, and evenly spaced, as if someone had taken great care in creating the trail. It was not the kind of prank children might play, nor did it seem like the work of animals. My instincts told me that this was deliberate, meant to draw my attention, though to what, I could not yet tell. A strange mixture of fear and curiosity gripped me, making it difficult to decide my next move. I stood and stared at the trail for a while, contemplating whether to follow it. The logical part of me insisted that I should ignore it entirely, maybe call someone to help figure out what was going on. But another part of me, driven by the need to understand, urged me to see where it led. Against my better judgment, I slowly followed the breadcrumbs, my steps cautious and deliberate. Each piece brought me closer to the front door, where I hesitated, wondering what I might find waiting for me. The trail ended abruptly at my welcome mat, as if whoever had left it had decided that this was the final destination. I looked down and noticed something else. There was a small envelope lying neatly on the mat, partially obscured by the last few crumbs. My heartbeat quickened as I bent down to pick it up. The envelope was plain white, unmarked except for the word open written in a rushed, uneven hand. The writing looked unfamiliar, but the message was clear. Whoever had left this wanted me to see it. I hesitated, the envelope feeling heavier in my hand than it should have. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. Was this a warning? A threat? Or was it some strange attempt at communication? The breadcrumbs, the envelope, it all felt too deliberate to be random. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me before sitting down at the kitchen table. My hands shook as I carefully opened the envelope, revealing a single piece of paper folded neatly inside. The note was short, written in the same uneven handwriting as the word on the envelope. "Follow the trail and you will understand," it read. My stomach turned as I read the cryptic message, the meaning of which was entirely unclear. The trail. Did it mean the breadcrumbs, or was there something else I was supposed to find? I thought about going back outside to look for more clues, but the idea of stepping out into the growing darkness filled me with unease. Instead, I stayed inside, replaying the moment I found the trail over and over in my mind. The rest of the evening was spent in a haze of nervous energy. I could not focus on anything else, my thoughts consumed by the strange message and the breadcrumbs leading to my door. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every small sound outside made me jump, and I found myself checking the locks on my doors and windows multiple times. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable, though I saw no signs of anyone lurking outside. Whatever this was, it was not over, and I could feel the tension building with each passing hour. The next morning, I decided to check my property for any additional clues. The trail of breadcrumbs was gone, either eaten by animals or swept away by the wind, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I searched the area around my house, looking for anything out of place. My efforts were fruitless until I reached the backyard. There, hidden beneath a small pile of leaves, I found another envelope, identical to the first. This one had the word "continue" scrawled across it in the same hurried handwriting. Opening it, I discovered another note inside. This time, the message was slightly longer. "Keep looking. You are closer than you think." The words sent a chill down my spine. Closer to what? And who was leaving these notes for me? The vague nature of the messages made it impossible to know what they were leading me toward, but the growing sense of dread made it clear that I was not ready to find out. I considered calling the police but hesitated, unsure of what I would even report. Breadcrumbs and mysterious notes hardly seemed like enough to warrant an investigation. Over the next few days, more breadcrumbs appeared around my property, leading to different locations. Each time, they ended with an envelope containing another cryptic message. Some were as brief as a single word, while others hinted at some unknown truth I was meant to uncover. "Patience," one note read. "Almost there," said another. The messages were maddening, giving me just enough to keep me on edge, but never enough to provide real answers. I felt like a pawn in someone else's game, and the feeling of powerlessness was suffocating. Eventually, the breadcrumbs stopped appearing, and with them the notes. But the sense of unease did not fade. I could not shake the feeling that someone was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal their intentions. I changed my locks, installed security cameras, and tried to return to my normal routine, but the paranoia lingered. The trail of breadcrumbs had led me to a new reality, one where I was constantly looking over my shoulder, unsure of who I could trust. The mystery of the notes remained unsolved, a puzzle I could not piece together, and the fear of what might come next never truly went away. Story 6. The 6. When I woke up, something felt off. The room was eerily quiet, as if the world outside had paused. I reached for my phone to check the time and froze. The screen displayed 12:34. I frowned, wondering if there had been a power outage that reset the clocks. But my phone wasn't connected to anything that could affect its time. Setting the phone aside, I climbed out of bed and glanced at the digital clock on my bedside table. It, too, read 12:34. A sinking feeling settled in my chest. I walked out of my bedroom and checked the microwave in the kitchen. And the hum of conversation around me flashed as passengers prepared to disembark. The same went for the oven clock and a small wall clock above the dining table. I weighed my options. Even my smartwatch, which the voice automatically now displayed the exact same time. The train came to a halt, and the doors began to race as I realized that forced myself to clock stepping out onto the platform with the crowd. The air outside was cooler, too deliberate, and I took a deep breath. Trying to stay calm, I double-checked the lights switch to turn around, looking for any sign of a power surge might have been watching me. Nothing seemed out. The platform stretched long and empty ahead of me. As it should. The crowd dispersing quickly stubbornly refused. I made my way to the far end, just as the voice of unease grew stronger with each passing minute. The further I walked, what should the quieter it became. If the clocks had sounds of the train and passengers faded into the background. The numbers stayed frozen. I stopped at the edge of the platform, the train pulling away behind me. I grabbed my phone, my heart was still racing, settings to manual, and I felt refreshed the time. Standing there alone. It should have synced automatically, stretched into minutes, and I began to wonder if I had made a mistake. Was I safely on the train, and was I now more vulnerable out here? Just as doubt began to creep in, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Whatever was happening wasn't some shadows at the other end of the platform. The air in the house felt tensed, but they did not approach. Instead, they stood still, running down my spine. I thought about calling someone, maybe a neighbor or a friend, mimicking the stranger's normal voice and confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I kept my gaze fixed on the figure, but the moment I opened the call calm, it froze. A moment they turned and walked away. The screen went disappearing down a stairwell before returning to the home screen. I let out a shaky breath. I tried again, the tension in my chest same result. Slightly. My phone refused to make calls. They had left. Even text messages questions still swirled in my mind. It was as if I had been tapped my shoulder. Cut off. What had they seen? Looking out the window, I noticed how still everything seemed. I did not wait to find out. The trees were motionless. I hurried to the nearest exit, my senses on high alert. The street outside, the night air hit me as I stepped outside. Early morning joggers, I felt an overwhelming urge to keep moving. Even the birds were silent. To put as much distance as possible between the entire world had been frozen in time. Even as I reached the safety of my home, I could feel sweat forming on my forehead despite the chill in the air. I locked my door. I decided to step outside, open for some sense of silence of my apartment. But when I opened the front door over and over, the silence was deafening. The tap on my shoulder, thick, the almost oppressive, and the figure as if it were pressing down on me for days. I looked at my watch. I never saw the stranger again, and I never learned who had been watching me or why. It did, but the memory stayed with me. Still a reminder of how quickly the ordinary can turn into something that felt like an eternity, waiting for anything to happen. It started as the world remained frozen. I was relaxing on the couch, like I was scrolling through my phone while my dog lay curled back inside. I checked every room. The quiet hum of the television filled the room. I inspected the background noise that I barely noticed. Breakers. My dog unplugged the clocks, hoping that might reset them. Suddenly lifted his head. When I plugged them back in, his ears perked up. They resumed their relentless display of 12:34. At first, I thought he had heard something outside a car. A neighbor's dog, being watched, or perhaps the wind. It was an irrational thought, but it was nothing unusual for him to react to sounds beyond the house. Something I wasn't to see. Abruptly. His attention fixed on what should have been hours dragged on, yet his growl deepened and his stance tried to distract myself, his body tense as though the television for something, but every channel was static. I followed his gaze to the corner with the radio, expecting to see a shadow or frustrated. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the clock on the microwave. The corner was empty, glowing numbers as it always had been. I couldn't help just to feel blank stretch of wall where the paint held some kind of significance. But I couldn't my dog's growl turned into a sharp bark. I thought about the sequence of numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hey, what is it? It felt deliberate, soft and almost like a message. He didn't respond or even glance my way. His focus raced with possibilities. His bark relentless as though supernatural. Something or someone as much as I wanted to dismiss the idea of stood up, his tail stiff as he continued to bark at the empty corner. What was happening made it hard to ignore. I got up and walked to the corner. At one point I grabbed a notebook and began jotting down everything I could think, looking closely at the wall. Had I missed the floor? And the ceiling above, a text or a phone call, nothing unusual, no bugs, no drafts. I racked my brain of anything, trying to remember if there had been any strange occurrences leading up to this morning, but nothing stood out. I even tapped my life had been perfectly ordinary until now. A hidden sound or vibration. The longer I explained his behavior, the more unsettled I became. Come on, I began to hear faint just a wall, soft creaks, I said, reaching out to pet. It seemed to come from nowhere. He flinched at my touch, they were letting out another sharp almost bark before stepping forward, but enough to put me almost on edge, as if he were trying to shield me from the empty space. His barking didn't waver, it only grew louder, more frantic. The sound echoed through the room, making my skin crawl. Minutes turned into an hour, and he didn't stop. He didn't move away from the corner, didn't back down. His barking filled the air, relentless and unsettling. My nerves began to fray as the persistent noise grated on me. I tried everything to calm him, offering treats, calling him to another room, even stepping outside to see if he would follow. But nothing worked. He stayed planted in front of that corner, barking like his life depended on it. I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. Dogs had instincts, senses sharper than ours, and the way he acted made me wonder if he was detecting something I couldn't see or hear. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Could it be a pest in the walls? A strange smell? Or was it something beyond explanation? Something I didn't want to consider? I turned off the television, hoping the silence would help me focus, but it only amplified the tension in the room. The barking seemed louder now, echoing in the stillness. I found myself staring at the corner too, as if I could will an answer to appear. The longer I looked, the more the ordinary corner seemed wrong. It was ridiculous, I told myself. There was nothing there. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was. The air in the room felt heavier somehow, as though the temperature had dropped a few degrees. A shiver ran down my spine as I rubbed my arms, trying to shake off the growing discomfort. My dog's barking took on a different tone, a higher pitch that sounded more like distress than warning. He took a step closer to the corner, his nose almost touching the wall now. His body trembled, and his tail dropped low, tucked between his legs. That was the moment I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. "All right, enough of this," I muttered, more to myself than to him. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining the beam directly at the corner. The light revealed nothing new, just the same plain wall, the same chipped paint. But it didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made the emptiness of the corner seem even more ominous. I paced the room, my anxiety growing with every passing minute. My dog finally stopped barking, but he didn't relax. Instead, he let out a low whine, his body still tense, his eyes fixed on the same spot. The silence was almost worse than the barking. It felt like the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I debated calling a friend or even leaving the house altogether. But what would I say? That my dog had been barking at an empty corner for an hour, and now I was too scared to stay home. It sounded absurd even to me, Still, the thought of spending the rest of the night alone in that house was becoming unbearable. I decided to take my dog outside, hoping a change of scenery would snap him out of his fixation. He hesitated at first, glancing back at the corner as though reluctant to leave it unguarded. But eventually he followed me out the door. The cool night air was a welcome relief, and for a moment, I thought I might be able to shake off the unease. But even outside, my dog seemed on edge. His ears twitched at every sound, his eyes darting around as if he expected something to appear. He stayed close to me, his usual curiosity replaced by a nervous energy that made my skin crawl. When we finally went back inside, I avoided looking at the corner altogether. My dog, however, didn't. He immediately returned to his spot, lying down this time but keeping his eyes locked on the same area. His body remained tense, and his breathing was shallow, almost as if he were bracing for something. I stayed up for hours that night, unable to sleep with a lingering sense of unease. The corner of the room felt like a gaping void, an empty space that somehow seemed full of something I couldn't see. Even after my dog finally fell asleep, his body curled tightly on the floor, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lights. The shadows felt too long, the silence too heavy. By morning, the corner was just a corner again. My dog acted as if nothing had happened, wagging his tail and barking playfully at the birds outside. But I couldn't forget the way he had barked, the way he had stared at the emptiness as though it held something I couldn't comprehend. I never did figure out what had set him off that night, but every time I pass that corner now, I feel a faint prickle at the back of my neck, a reminder of the hours spent in a room that no longer felt like my own. Story 9. The package was sitting on my doorstep when I got home, a plain cardboard box with no branding or markings. At first, I thought it must have been left there by mistake. I picked it up, expecting to see a neighbor's name or address, but instead the label read, "To the new resident." That was odd. I hadn't ordered anything, and the title felt impersonal yet strangely directed. A chill ran through me as I stared at it, the words feeling heavier than they should have. I brought it inside, placing it on the table while I debated whether to open it. The box was light, barely weighing anything, which only made it more mysterious. I turned it over, inspecting it for any clue about its origin. There was no return address, no sender information, just those 3 words printed neatly on the label. I couldn't remember the last time I had received a package without knowing it was coming. Something about this felt wrong. After a few moments of hesitation, I decided to open it. Using scissors, I carefully sliced through the tape, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. Inside, I found a single piece of paper folded in half, sitting on a layer of white tissue. No other contents, no explanation, just the paper. I unfolded it slowly, dreading what I might find. Written in neat, black handwriting were the words, "Welcome to your new home." My first thought was that it had to be some kind of promotional gimmick. Maybe a realtor or a local business was trying to introduce themselves to the neighborhood. But the wording struck me as odd. I hadn't just moved in, I had been living here for over a year. Whoever sent this wasn't welcoming me as a new neighbor, they were calling me out as someone unfamiliar, someone they saw as a recent arrival. I felt a prickle of unease. Who would send something like this? And why? I thought about throwing the package away, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I set it aside and tried to focus on other things. But the thought lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, someone who had taken notice of me in a way that felt too deliberate. The next morning, I checked with my neighbors to see if anyone else had received a similar package. They all shook their heads, looking puzzled. One of them joked that it sounded like something out of a mystery novel, but their laughter did little to ease my nerves. If this was some kind of prank, it was a strange and unsettling one. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why would someone go to the trouble of sending an anonymous package with such a cryptic message? I decided to search online for any information about similar incidents. Stories of mysterious packages weren't uncommon, but most turned out to be harmless misdelivered parcels or marketing stunts. None of them matched what I had received. The lack of answers only deepened my unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was personal, that someone was trying to get my attention for reasons I couldn't understand. Over the next few days, I found myself growing more paranoid. Every time I passed a window, I glanced outside, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. I started double-checking that the doors were locked before going to bed, even though I had never been particularly worried about security before. The package had planted a seed of fear in my mind, and I couldn't seem to uproot it. Then, a week later, another package arrived. This one was smaller, wrapped in plain brown paper with the same label, "To New Resident." My stomach sank as I picked it up, dread washing over me. I carried it inside and placed it on the table, staring at it for a long time before I finally opened it. Inside was another note, this time with a single line, "We've been waiting for you." My hands trembled as I read the words. Whoever was doing this wasn't just playing a harmless joke. They wanted me to feel unsettled, to know that I was being watched. The message felt like a warning, though I couldn't understand what it was meant to convey. Who were we? What were they waiting for? And why target me? I considered calling the authorities, but what would I tell them? I had received a couple of strange packages with vague notes inside. It wasn't exactly a crime, and I doubted they would take it seriously. Still, the thought of someone targeting me like this, knowing where I lived and leaving these messages, made my skin crawl. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I decided to set up a security camera outside my door, hoping to catch whoever was leaving the packages. It felt like a small step, but it gave me a sense of control in a situation where I felt helpless. Every day I checked the footage, scanning for anything unusual. Days turned into weeks, and nothing happened. No more packages, no strange visitors, nothing out of the ordinary. I started to wonder if it had all been a one-time thing, a bizarre coincidence that would never be explained. But then, late one night, I woke up to the sound of something hitting my window. I froze, my heart pounding as I listened intently. The sound came again, a faint tapping, like someone was throwing pebbles at the glass. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the window, my hands shaking. Pulling the curtain aside, I peered outside but saw nothing. The street was empty, the night still. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as if someone was out there, hiding just beyond my line of sight. The next morning I found another package on my doorstep. This one was different, a small black box with no label, no markings, nothing. I didn't open it. Instead, I called the authorities, finally deciding that I couldn't handle this alone. When they arrived, I explained everything, from the first package to the notes and the tapping on my window. They took the box with them, promising to investigate, but their expressions told me they didn't expect to find much. Days passed, and I heard nothing from the authorities. The packages stopped coming, but the fear remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had sent them was still out there, watching, waiting. Every knock on the door, every unexpected sound, sent a jolt of panic through me. I had no idea what they wanted or if they would come back, but I knew one thing for certain: I would never feel truly safe again. Story 10. It was early morning when I walked out to my car, the air crisp and cool against my skin. The neighborhood was quiet, still waking up, and the usual hum of distant traffic was faint. I approached my car, balancing my bag on one shoulder and holding a coffee cup in my free hand. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but as I moved closer, something caught my eye. My car's side mirror looked off, adjusted to an angle I never used. I paused, staring at it for a moment. My first thought was that someone must have bumped it during the night, maybe a passing cyclist or a pedestrian. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't just nudged out of place, it had been deliberately moved. The angle was odd, tilted upward in a way that made no sense for anyone trying to use it while driving. My stomach sank. I hadn't touched it, and no one else had access to my car. I set my coffee down on the roof and bent closer to inspect the mirror. There were no scratches or smudges to suggest someone had handled it roughly, but the precise adjustment sent a chill through me. I straightened up and glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. The houses on my street stood quiet and unassuming, their windows dark or shielded by curtains. A lone bird chirped somewhere nearby, the sound stark against the eerie stillness. Shaking off the unease, I climbed into the car and settled into the driver's seat. Before starting the engine, I reached over to adjust the mirror back to its usual position. My hand hesitated for a moment, as if touching it might reveal something I didn't want to know. I forced myself to turn the knob, realigning the mirror until it reflected the view I was accustomed to. As I did, I noticed my hand trembling slightly, a subtle reminder of the unease lingering in the back of my mind. I told myself it was nothing, a coincidence, maybe an innocent mistake. Perhaps a curious kid had wandered by, fiddling with whatever they could reach. It was the only explanation that made sense, and I clung to it as I pulled out of the driveway. But as I drove through the familiar streets, the thought kept gnawing at me. Why would someone adjust the mirror to such an odd angle? It wasn't just a random nudge, it felt intentional, deliberate. Throughout the day, I tried to push the incident out of my mind. Work was busy and I had plenty to distract me, but every so often, my thoughts drifted back to the mirror. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, as if someone had been standing outside my car in the dark, adjusting the mirror for reasons I couldn't comprehend. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual, my nerves on edge. By the time I finished work, the unease had settled into a dull thrum in my chest. As I walked back to my car in the dimly lit parking lot, I found myself scanning the area, looking for anything or anyone out of place. The lot was nearly empty, just a handful of cars scattered across the spaces. My car sat where I had left it, nothing visibly out of the ordinary. But as I approached, I felt the same chill from that morning creeping over me. I checked the mirrors before getting in, relieved to see they were still in the correct position. It was a small comfort, but it helped. The drive home was uneventful, though I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror more often than necessary. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the tension in my shoulders eased slightly. Home felt safe, or at least safer than being out on the road. I parked the car and climbed out, locking it with a click of the key fob. As I turned to head inside, I hesitated, a strange urge pulling me back to the car. I circled around to the passenger side, my eyes scanning every inch of the vehicle. Everything seemed fine, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I glanced at the side mirror one last time, half expecting it to have shifted again. It hadn't, but that did little to calm my nerves. That night, sleep came slowly. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the day's events. The adjusted mirror, the sense of unease, the feeling that something or someone was just out of reach, watching from the shadows. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that there was more to come. The next morning I approached my car with trepidation, my heart pounding as I rounded the corner of the house. To my relief, the mirrors were untouched, just as I had left them. But the relief was short-lived. As I opened the driver's door and slid into the seat, I noticed something small and out of place, a folded piece of paper tucked into the cup holder. My breath caught as I reached for it, my fingers trembling. Unfolding the paper, I found a single sentence scrawled in messy handwriting: "You should pay attention." My heart raced as I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. Who had left this? And why? The paper offered no answers, only more questions. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the empty street and the neighboring yards. There was no one in sight. I folded the note back up and shoved it into my pocket, my mind racing. The adjusted mirror, the cryptic message: was someone playing a prank, or was this something more sinister? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whoever had done this was still out there, waiting for my next move. The rest of the day passed in a blur of paranoia and unease. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, jumping at every unexpected noise. By the time I returned home that evening, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. I parked the car and locked it, double-checking that all the doors were secure. As I walked to the front door, I glanced back at the car one last time, my stomach knotting with dread. The mirror was tilted again, back to that strange, unnatural angle. Story 11. I walked into the bathroom, ready to start my morning routine. The light was dim, the only source of illumination coming from the small fixture above the mirror. I went to the sink to wash my face, still half asleep, when I noticed something strange on the counter. It was a hairbrush, sitting there next to the soap dish. I didn't remember leaving it there, and at first, I thought I must have forgotten. Maybe it belonged to a visitor, but I couldn't recall anyone being over recently. I picked it up, running my fingers over the bristles. The brush itself looked ordinary enough, though I noticed it was slightly worn, the kind of thing that might have been used for a while. But what really caught my attention was the hair that was caught in the bristles. It wasn't mine. I stared at the strands, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The hair was darker than mine, thicker and longer. It didn't belong to anyone I knew. I set the brush down gently on the counter, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just a mistake. Maybe someone had dropped it here without realizing. I thought back to the last time I had visitors. My friends had been over a week ago, but none of them had hair like this. None of them had been in my bathroom, either. I could feel the unease creeping in as I tried to think of a logical explanation, but nothing seemed to make sense. I leaned in closer, inspecting the hair. It was a deep brown color, silky in texture, and the strands were long enough to be from someone with shoulder-length hair, perhaps longer. I didn't recognize it, and that fact unsettled me. Had someone been in my bathroom without my knowledge? Had they used my things? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. I thought about the few people who had keys to my house, family members and close friends, but none of them would have left their hair behind. None of them had the kind of hair I was looking at. I turned the brush over, hoping to find anything that could explain the situation. But there was nothing. No note, no sign of who it belonged to. Just a hairbrush with unfamiliar hair tangled in the bristles. I felt a chill spread through my body. It wasn't just the fact that the hair didn't belong to me, it was the fact that someone had been in my home without my permission. The thought was too unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. I quickly left the bathroom and walked into the kitchen, trying to distract myself. I made a cup of coffee, hoping that the caffeine would clear my head. But the image of the hairbrush stayed with me. I kept replaying the scene over and over in my mind, trying to figure out how I could have missed something so obvious. I hadn't been out of town recently, and no one had been staying with me. The house was just as I had left it, except for the hairbrush. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I went back to the bathroom, hoping that maybe I had missed something in my initial inspection. I picked up the brush again and examined it more carefully. This time I noticed something else, a faint, almost imperceptible smell on the bristles. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was unfamiliar, like a perfume I had never smelled before. It was subtle, but it made my skin crawl. What was going on? I decided to call my best friend, hoping she could offer some insight. Maybe I had simply forgotten something, or perhaps I was overreacting. She answered after the second ring. "Hello," she said, her voice groggy as if she had just woken up. "Hey, it's me. I need to ask you something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I explained the situation, telling her about the hairbrush and the strange hair that wasn't mine. She was quiet for a moment, as if considering my words. "That's really weird," she said finally. "Are you sure it wasn't just a mix-up? Maybe you grabbed someone else's brush by accident." "I don't think so," I replied, shaking my head even though she couldn't see me. "I haven't had anyone over since last week, and I'm pretty sure none of my friends have hair like that." She was silent for a moment before speaking again. "Okay, that's a little unsettling. Are you sure there's no explanation for it? Maybe you didn't notice it before?" I considered her words, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "I don't know. I keep thinking about it, and it just doesn't make sense. I don't know what to think." "Maybe you should check the rest of the house," she suggested. "Look around, see if anything else seems out of place." I agreed, though I didn't want to. The idea of searching my house for signs of something or someone else made me feel uneasy, but I didn't see another option. I thanked her for the advice and ended the call. I took a deep breath and started to check every room, one by one. I went through the living room, the kitchen, the bedrooms, and even the closets. Everything seemed in its place, but the more I looked, the more paranoid I became. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow seemed like a potential clue. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in my home, watching me. When I reached my bedroom, I noticed something else strange. The bed was made, but the sheets weren't exactly as I had left them. I couldn't say why, but they looked slightly disturbed, as if someone had lain there recently. I immediately checked the nightstand and the drawers, half expecting to find something that didn't belong to me, but there was nothing. I sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to process everything. Was I imagining things? Had I missed something? Or was there someone out there, someone who knew where I lived and had been inside my house? I couldn't stop thinking about the hairbrush and the strange smell. It felt like I was losing control of everything. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fall into place in ways I didn't understand. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't concentrate on anything, my mind constantly going back to the hairbrush. I kept trying to rationalize the situation, to convince myself that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone knew more about my life than I did. That night, I made sure to lock every door and window before going to bed. I set up a few motion sensors I had lying around just in case. I didn't sleep much, my mind constantly racing with questions. What did it mean? Who had left the hairbrush, and why? And most importantly, was I safe? Story 12. The morning started like any other. I walked into the office, my usual routine guiding me as I hung my jacket and settled into my desk. The office was quiet, the faint hum of computers and a rustle of papers the only sounds breaking the silence. I logged into my computer and glanced over at my desk drawer, the one I kept locked. Nothing unusual ever came from there, but today as I went to grab some paper clips, something caught my eye. There, nestled among a stack of old receipts and miscellaneous office supplies, was a letter. At first I thought it was just another piece of old correspondence someone had left behind by mistake, but when I picked it up, I noticed something odd. The letter was addressed to me. My full name was written in neat, cursive handwriting on the envelope, but what really made me freeze was the date. It was dated 20 years ago. I stared at it, my heart skipping a beat. I had been working at this office for less than 5 years. There was no way this letter could have been sent to me, but here it was, sitting in my desk drawer, untouched by time, as if it had been waiting for me all along. My mind raced. I wasn't sure what to think. The letter had clearly been there for a long time, but I had never seen it before. My first instinct was to tear it open and read what it said, but my hands hesitated, uncertain about what I might find. I sat down at my desk, the letter still in my hands. The envelope felt old, the edges slightly worn, but the paper inside was pristine. My curiosity got the best of me, and I slowly began to open the envelope. As I slid the letter out, I noticed the handwriting was unfamiliar, but there was something strangely familiar about it. The words seemed distant, as if they were calling to me from some forgotten memory, but I couldn't place why. I unfolded the letter, my fingers trembling slightly as I read the first line. "Dear, my name. I hope this letter reaches you at the time when you need it most." My breath caught in my throat. The words felt heavy, like they were carrying a weight I couldn't understand. The letter went on to explain things that made little sense to me. It spoke of events I didn't recognize, places I'd never been, and people I couldn't place. But somehow it all felt so personal. The writer described things about my life, things I had never shared with anyone, like they had known me my entire life. The letter mentioned a choice I would soon face, a decision that would change everything. It spoke of a future that hadn't happened yet, but it felt strangely accurate, as though it were predicting the path my life was about to take. The more I read, the more the words seemed to fit into place, like pieces of a puzzle I had been trying to solve for years. I had to stop. My mind was racing. I set the letter down on the desk, staring at it as if it held the answers to all the questions I had ever asked. How was this possible? How had this letter ended up in my desk drawer? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many things about my life didn't add up. Had I somehow misplaced the letter all these years? Had someone else hidden it here? Or was there something more sinister at play? I glanced around the office, the familiar surroundings suddenly feeling unfamiliar, as though everything had shifted in the span of a few moments. No one else was in the room, and the silence felt deafening. I stood up from my chair and paced around, trying to clear my mind. The letter felt like a riddle, one I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. But deep down I knew I couldn't just leave it there, unsolved. It was as though I was being pulled into something much bigger than I could understand. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, my hands shaking. I locked the drawer and sat back down at my desk, trying to focus on work. But I couldn't. The words of the letter kept echoing in my mind, looping over and over. It was as if the letter had unlocked something I hadn't even realized was locked away. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went through the motions of work, answering emails, attending meetings, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something had changed. My mind kept drifting back to that letter, to the cryptic message it contained. Who had written it? Why did it feel like it was meant for me? even though it was written so long ago. When I left the office that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The letter weighed on me, heavy in my thoughts. I decided to take it home with me, determined to find some answers. As I walked to my car, I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the street was empty. It was just another quiet evening, except now everything felt different. I sat down at my kitchen table when I got home and unfolded the letter again, reading through it once more. The more I read, the more I began to piece things together. The letter spoke of a decision I was about to make, something I hadn't even realized was coming. It mentioned a crossroads in my life, a moment when everything would change. The writer urged me to be cautious, to think carefully before making the wrong choice. I sat back in my chair, staring at the letter in disbelief. What was it trying to tell me? What was this choice I was supposed to make? And who had written it? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? Or was it something else entirely, something that I couldn't yet comprehend? As the night wore on, I found myself unable to let go of the letter. The more I tried to push it out of my mind, the more questions it raised. I couldn't shake the feeling that this letter, dated 20 years ago, had been meant for me, and somehow it had found its way into my hands at exactly the right moment. It was almost as if it had been waiting for me to find it, waiting for me to make sense of it. But even with all the pieces in front of me, I couldn't quite put it together. The letter had opened a door, but what lay on the other side, I didn't yet know. Story 13. It was a quiet morning when I first noticed it. I had just finished my coffee, and the familiar hum of my phone buzzed on the table beside me. I reached for it, checking my notifications as usual. That's when something strange caught my eye. There was a new app icon on my home screen, a blue and white logo I didn't recognize. The name of the app was Follow Me. I was certain I hadn't downloaded anything recently, and this app didn't look familiar in the slightest. I stared at it for a few moments, unsure of what to do. It didn't have the typical App Store icon or anything to indicate it was a legitimate download. My thumb hovered over the app icon, hesitation swirling inside me. I didn't remember authorizing any new apps, so how had it appeared? I tried to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was a mistake, some glitch, or an app I had forgotten about. I had the habit of downloading something and forgetting about it, but this was different. This app was completely foreign, and I felt a knot form in my stomach as I considered the possibility that someone had access to my phone. But that didn't make sense, either. My phone had a passcode, and I was the only one who had the code. After a long pause, I decided to open it, against my better judgment. The app didn't ask for any permissions or prompt me to log in. It just opened straight to a map-like screen. The layout was simple. There was a globe in the center, with a few blinking dots scattered around it. I zoomed in, trying to make sense of it. The dots seemed to represent locations, some of them close, some far away, but none of them looked like places I had visited recently. I didn't recognize any of the names that popped up as I tapped the map. My mind raced with questions. What was this? And why was it on my phone? I tried tapping one of the dots, and the screen shifted, showing a list of coordinates and a small box of text that said, "Track active." It sounded like the app was tracking something, but what exactly? I checked my phone settings to see if there were any explanations or recent activity that could shed some light on how the app was installed. But there were no unusual logs, no sign of any new downloads or updates. It was as if the app had appeared out of nowhere, with no trace of how it got there. I quickly went to my app store to search for it, hoping to find something about Follow Me that might explain its sudden appearance. But when I searched, there was nothing, no results, no app, no description. It was like the app didn't even exist in the App Store, which only made the whole situation feel stranger. If it wasn't on the store, how had it ended up on my phone? Panic began to settle in. I opened up my security settings, looking through everything I could think of to ensure my phone was secure. There were no signs of anything unusual, no malware or unauthorized access. But how could that be? A new app had appeared on my phone, one that I hadn't downloaded. What if someone had bypassed my security in a way I couldn't see? I tried to delete the app, hoping that would solve everything, but when I pressed the delete option, nothing happened. It was like the app wasn't there to be removed. The icon remained, sitting innocently on my screen, mocking my frustration. I tried restarting my phone, thinking it might be a temporary glitch. But when the phone rebooted, the app was still there, staring back at me. The more I stared at the Follow Me app, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. The app had no description, no reviews, no information at all. It was as if it had materialized out of thin air. I began to wonder if I had missed something, if there was some step I had overlooked that would explain its sudden appearance. But every theory I came up with felt unsatisfying. There was no way I could have downloaded it by accident, and there was no record of anyone else having done so. I started to feel paranoid. What if someone had installed the app remotely, or worse, had physical access to my phone without me knowing? It didn't make sense. My phone was always with me, and I had been very careful about keeping it locked. Could someone have somehow bypassed the security? The thought made my skin crawl. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the app. What if it was tracking me, or worse, watching me? Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the blinking dots on the map, as if they were following my every move. I checked my phone again, but everything seemed normal. The app was still there, untouched and still unopened. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was controlling it, that they were watching me in some way I couldn't understand. Every time I checked my phone, I felt a pang of fear in my chest, wondering if the app was silently observing, tracking, waiting. It was a feeling of being watched, of having no control over something that had been planted inside my life without my consent. The next morning I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I was overthinking it. I had heard of strange app glitches before, of weird tech problems that defied explanation. Maybe this was just one of those moments, a hiccup in the system. But I couldn't convince myself completely. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that something was off. I decided to reach out to some tech-savvy friends for advice, hoping they might have some insight into what was happening. But when I tried to show them the app, it was gone. I couldn't find it anywhere on my phone. I checked every folder, every page of my home screen, but there was no sign of it. I even searched for it using the search function on my phone, but the results were empty. I felt a mix of relief and confusion. The app was gone. But had I imagined it all? No, I hadn't. I remembered everything vividly. I had seen it, I had interacted with it, and I had tried to remove it. But now it was as if it had never existed at all. The absence of it left me more unsettled than ever. Or did it mean that it had just disappeared without a trace? How was I supposed to feel now that the app had vanished as mysteriously as it had arrived? I couldn't stop thinking about it. Even though the app was gone, the unease remained. What if it had been a warning, a message, or worse, a trap? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something that I wasn't prepared to face. It was as if the app had been a glimpse into something I wasn't meant to see, something beyond my understanding. Story 14. It had been one of those days where everything felt out of place. I had been cleaning out my closet, trying to make space for some new clothes I had bought. The clutter seemed endless, and every time I thought I was getting close to finishing, I found something else that needed sorting. After pulling out a stack of old sweaters, I reached for the last few items shoved into the corner of the closet. As I moved things around, my hand brushed against a pair of gloves. At first, I didn't think much of it. Gloves weren't unusual to find in a closet. Sometimes they'd end up in there after being tossed aside or forgotten. But when I picked them up, something about them felt different. The leather was soft, the fabric still fresh, almost as if they had been used recently. I didn't remember owning a pair like these, nor did I recall wearing any gloves in the past few weeks. The gloves were sleek, black, with a subtle design that suggested they were expensive. I turned them over in my hands, trying to remember if I had bought them or if they had belonged to someone else. There was no tag or distinguishing mark that would identify them as mine. I wondered if perhaps they had been left behind by a guest, but none of my friends or family members wore gloves like this. I examined the gloves more closely, running my fingers over the seams and the stitching. They looked well made, not something you'd pick up on a whim at a local store. The leather felt smooth, and the fit seemed almost perfect for my hands, though I had no memory of ever owning a pair. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. Why hadn't I noticed them before? I took a step back and scanned the rest of the closet, half expecting to see something else unusual. But everything else seemed just as I had left it. The gloves, however, stood out. They didn't belong to anything else in the closet. It wasn't just that they were unexpected, it was the way they felt, almost as if they had been placed there recently. I decided to check my recent purchases, pulling out my phone and looking through my shopping history. Nothing came up that matched the description of the gloves. I couldn't remember buying them, and it didn't make sense for them to appear out of nowhere. My mind started racing with possibilities. Had someone been in my home without my knowledge? Could they have left them behind as some sort of clue? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thoughts. I was overthinking things, but the idea wouldn't leave me. I decided to ask my family. I called my mom and siblings, but no one recognized the gloves. They hadn't seen them before, and none of them had been in my closet recently. It was strange. The gloves didn't fit any of them, and they certainly weren't mine. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about them. I tried to focus on other things, but every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing the gloves in my mind, wondering how they had ended up in my closet. I considered throwing them away, but something stopped me. There was no logical reason for them to be there, and that uncertainty made me hesitant to take action. I didn't want to throw something out that might end up having significance later. The next day, I mentioned the gloves to a close friend, hoping they might offer an explanation. They looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Maybe someone gave them to you as a gift," they suggested, but I knew that wasn't the case. I hadn't received any gifts recently, certainly not a pair of gloves. Besides, they didn't feel like a gift from anyone I knew. As the days passed, I started to notice something strange. Every time I returned to the closet, the gloves were in a slightly different position. At first, I thought I was just imagining things, but after a while it became undeniable. I was sure I hadn't moved them, and yet they weren't where I had left them. It felt like someone or something was shifting them when I wasn't looking. I checked the closet thoroughly, convinced there must be some explanation. Had they been placed on a shelf that I hadn't noticed before? I searched every corner, but there was nothing that made sense. No hidden compartments, no secret places where the gloves could have been tucked away. They simply didn't belong there. The eerie feeling grew stronger. I started to wonder if the gloves were some sort of message or warning. They had appeared so suddenly, with no explanation. No one could identify them, and no one had a reasonable explanation for why they were in my closet. It was as though they were waiting for me to notice them. I decided to give up trying to figure out where they had come from and what they meant. Perhaps they were simply an odd coincidence, a mystery that I would never solve. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Every time I opened the closet, the gloves seemed to be watching me, a reminder that not everything in my life was as simple as it appeared. I kept the gloves, though I never wore them. They remained tucked away in the back of my closet, a silent presence that lingered in the background of my life. Occasionally I would glance at them, wondering if they held any meaning that I had missed, but I never felt the urge to touch them again. The mystery was too unsettling. I couldn't explain how they had come into my possession or why they had been left in such a peculiar place. All I knew was that they didn't belong to me, and that alone was enough to make me wary of them. Story 15. A stranger approached me at a gas station and said, "It's already too late." The words hung in the air, strange and unsettling, as I turned to face him. He was standing too close, his unkempt clothes and wild eyes giving off an eerie vibe. I didn't recognize him, and he didn't look like someone who would be casually approaching others in public spaces. My heart rate increased, and I instinctively took a step back, unsure whether I should be worried or if I was just overreacting. The stranger didn't move, though his eyes seemed to search mine for some kind of recognition. I wanted to say something, ask him what he meant, but my throat felt dry, and I couldn't seem to find the right words. The tension between us grew, thick and heavy. His words kept echoing in my mind, "It's already too late." Too late for what? I had no idea. Nothing about this felt like a coincidence. There was something about his presence, the way he seemed so intent on delivering this message, that made me feel as though I had missed something important, something I should have noticed long before now. He was still staring at me, his gaze unwavering. "You don't know, do you?" he said next, his voice low but clear. His words felt deliberate, almost as if he was trying to force some kind of truth into my awareness. I swallowed hard, trying to process what he was saying. What did he know that I didn't? Why had he come to me at this moment, at this gas station of all places? The more I thought about it, the more the sense of dread crept up my spine. I finally managed to speak, though my voice felt foreign to me. "Who are you?" I asked, my words tinged with uncertainty. "What are you talking about?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, and my body tensed, instinctively preparing for something I couldn't predict. He looked past me for a moment, as though he were watching something behind me, then back to my face, his expression unreadable. "It's too late," he repeated, shaking his head as if disappointed in my lack of understanding. "You should have listened when you had the chance." His words were vague, but they carried a weight I couldn't shake. It felt as though he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to arrive at some sort of realization that I hadn't yet grasped. But what? I couldn't make sense of any of it. Before I could ask another question, he turned and walked away. Just like that, he vanished into the crowd of people coming and going at the gas station. My mind raced, my thoughts colliding with one another in a frantic swirl. Was it a warning? A threat? Or something else entirely? I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something I hadn't noticed yet. And now, according to the stranger, it was already too late to stop it. I quickly got back into my car, locking the doors behind me and starting the engine. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, but I couldn't shake the stranger's words. "It's already too late." The phrase echoed over and over in my mind, like a warning bell I couldn't silence. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following me, but there was nothing. No sign of him, just the usual hustle of the gas station in my rearview. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't focus on anything but that encounter. What had he meant? I couldn't stop thinking about the way he said it, the look in his eyes. He hadn't been threatening, not exactly, but there was something in his tone and the urgency of his message that made my skin crawl. It felt like he was trying to force me into a state of realization, like he knew something I didn't, and now it was too late for me to act on it. But what? I tried to shake the thoughts out of my head, but they kept coming back relentlessly. When I got home, I went straight to the door and locked it behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as though the stranger's words had somehow opened a door I couldn't close. I had to know what he meant. Was there something I missed? Was it a warning about something that was going to happen to me, or something I had already done? I didn't have any answers, but the questions gnawed at me, leaving me restless and uneasy. The days that followed were filled with unease. I couldn't help but replay the moment at the gas station over and over in my mind, trying to figure out if there was something I could have done differently. But it always came back to the same question. What did he mean by "it's already too late"? I started to notice things around me that I hadn't before. Subtle shifts in my environment, strange occurrences that didn't seem to make sense. I felt like I was unraveling, like there was something I had overlooked, something right in front of me that I couldn't see. I went back to the gas station a few days later, hoping to catch a glimpse of the stranger or find out more about who he was. But when I arrived, there was no sign of him. The station was just like any other, busy with people coming and going, filling their cars, paying for gas. I walked around for a while, hoping to see him again, but he never appeared. It was as though he had never been there in the first place, a figment of my imagination. But I knew better. The encounter had been real. His words, the feeling of unease, the sense that something was wrong, it had all been real. Time passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger had been right. Whatever was supposed to happen had already started, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The more I thought about it, the more the sense of inevitability settled over me. I had missed my chance to change something, and now I would have to live with the consequences, whatever they were. But what were those consequences? What had I overlooked? I still had no answers, and the stranger's words haunted me, reminding me that it was already too late to find them. Story 16. I had just finished a long day, and after a quiet evening of scrolling through my phone, I decided to check my doorbell camera. It had become a habit to glance at the footage from time to time, just to see if there was anything unusual, though I rarely saw anything noteworthy. But that night, something caught my attention. The camera had recorded a figure standing in front of my house, completely still. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. Who was this person? And why were they just standing there doing nothing? The footage showed the figure clearly someone dressed in dark clothes, their face obscured by a hoodie. The person stood perfectly still, not moving at all. At first I thought it could have been a mistake, maybe a glitch in the camera, but no, this person didn't budge. The timestamp on the video indicated that they had been standing there for hours, and as I scrolled through the footage, my anxiety grew. How had I not noticed this sooner? I pulled up the video from the beginning, trying to make sense of it. The person had arrived just after sunset, their figure barely visible in the dim light. I watched, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the minutes passed, and still, they didn't move. Not a twitch, not a shift in posture. They just stood there, facing my house. My mind raced, and I tried to come up with any logical explanation. Was it a prank? A security guard? A lost person? But nothing seemed to fit. I started to feel a growing sense of unease, as though something about this person's stillness was unnatural. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were waiting for someone. Maybe they were lost. But as the hours dragged on, that explanation began to seem more and more unlikely. It wasn't just that they hadn't moved. It was that they hadn't even reacted to anything around them. There was no sign of discomfort, no glancing around as if looking for someone. They simply stood there, staring at my house. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. The figure was still there, hour after hour, without any sign of life other than their constant, unnerving presence. It was as if they were waiting for something, or perhaps waiting for nothing at all. My heart raced, and I began to wonder if I should call the police. But I hesitated. Was this really an emergency? Was I overreacting? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The hours on the footage blurred together, but it was clear that this person had no intention of leaving. I watched as the night wore on, and the figure remained frozen in place, as though they were part of the scenery itself. At one point, a car drove past, but the figure didn't flinch. Not even a subtle movement to acknowledge the vehicle's passing. I began to feel a creeping sensation in the pit of my stomach, a feeling I couldn't explain. It was as though this person wasn't just a random stranger. They were intentionally keeping watch, and it felt deeply invasive. As the hours ticked by, I became obsessed with the footage. I couldn't stop watching it, even though it only made me more anxious. I checked the time again and again, but the figure didn't budge. I even considered going outside, confronting them, but something told me it was better not to. There was something about the stillness, the complete absence of any emotion or movement, that made me think this person wasn't someone I should approach. It felt dangerous in a way I couldn't explain. At some point, I noticed something strange in the footage. In the corner of the frame, just outside the range of the doorbell camera's view, a second figure appeared. It was a shadow, barely visible in the dim light, and it seemed to be approaching the first figure. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't tell who or what this second figure was, but it didn't seem to be the same person. They moved silently, as though they were aware of the camera but didn't care. The second figure got closer, and my breath caught in my throat. The first figure didn't acknowledge the second person at all. They remained completely still, as if they hadn't noticed the newcomer at all. The shadowy figure circled around, remaining just outside the range of the camera. I watched in silent horror, wondering what was going to happen next. But the second figure didn't approach directly. They just stood there, lingering in the background like an observer. It was then that I realized just how long the first person had been standing there, how many hours had passed since they first appeared. And yet, despite the passage of time, nothing had changed. I checked the timestamp again, confirming that this had been going on for far longer than it should have. It was as though these two figures were playing a strange, unspoken game, and I had no idea what the rules were. My mind raced with possibilities. What did they want? Why were they standing in front of my house without moving, without speaking? Were they trying to send me a message? Or was there something more sinister going on? The more I watched, the more my paranoia grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I was somehow a part of whatever strange encounter was unfolding. The hours stretched on, and the two figures remained in place. I considered calling the police, but I didn't know how to explain what I had seen. There's someone standing outside my house and not moving for hours. Would they take me seriously? Would anyone believe that this wasn't just some strange coincidence or harmless event? I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I watched the footage again and again, until finally, just before dawn, the figures disappeared. In the blink of an eye, they were gone, vanished into thin air. I checked the timestamp once more, confirming that they had been standing there for hours, and yet the moment I looked away, they were simply gone. I sat there, staring at the screen, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Had they left? Or had they been watching me leave? The silence that followed was almost deafening. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. The figures, their stillness, their disappearance, it didn't make sense. I stared at the blank footage, waiting for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The world outside seemed just as still as it had been before, and yet everything felt different, as if I had just encountered something I wasn't supposed to see, something that had been there all along, right outside my door. I sat there for a long time, unsure of what to do next. What had I seen? Who were those people? And why were they outside my house for hours without moving? The questions filled my mind, but I had no answers. Only the quiet hum of my doorbell camera and the unsettling knowledge that something was watching me, and I wasn't sure if it was over. Story 17. I had just come home after a long day at work, the weight of the day's stress still pressing down on me. The familiar warmth of my apartment greeted me as I stepped inside, but something felt different. I tossed my keys onto the entryway table and kicked off my shoes, the usual comfort of my home not settling in as it usually did. I walked through the living room, looking for the space to unwind, my eyes landing on my favorite chair. It was the one place where I could always find solace after a tiring day, worn in, cozy, and perfectly molded to fit my body. But tonight it felt off. I walked over and sat down, expecting the usual comforting warmth that came from sitting in it, but instead, a chill ran up my spine. The chair was colder than the rest of the room, as if it had been left outside in the cold, exposed to the elements. I rubbed my hands together and tried to ignore the unsettling feeling, but the coldness seeped into me, making it impossible to get comfortable. I stood up and inspected the chair, running my hand along its surface. The fabric felt stiff, as though it hadn't been used in days. I checked the window nearby, half expecting to see it slightly open, but no, everything was in place. There was no draft in the room, no reason for the sudden chill that had taken over the chair. A strange unease crept into me as I realized that this wasn't just a normal cold spot. It felt intentional, as though the chair itself was trying to tell me something. I shrugged it off, thinking that maybe I was just tired or overly sensitive. Perhaps the heating system was malfunctioning, and the cold air had settled in that corner of the room. Still, something about it felt wrong. I walked back to the chair, this time sitting down more cautiously, hoping that the sensation would pass, but it didn't. The coldness was too persistent, too odd. My mind raced, thinking of explanations, but none seemed to make sense. Maybe I had forgotten to turn on the heater, or maybe I had left the door open at some point, allowing the cold air to drift in unnoticed. But even as I searched for logical explanations, a small part of me wondered if there was something more to it. The chair had always been a place of comfort, never something that left me feeling unsettled. Why now? Why tonight? I stood up once more and moved to the kitchen to get a drink, hoping the coldness would dissipate when I returned. As I poured myself a glass of water, I couldn't help but glance back at the chair, still feeling its presence in the room, as though it were waiting for me to come back and sit down. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts racing through my mind. I was just imagining things, I told myself. There was nothing wrong with the chair. But when I returned and sat down again, the same coldness enveloped me, more pronounced this time. It was as if the chair had become a vessel for something unknown, something that didn't belong in my home. I shivered involuntarily, and this time the sensation wasn't just physical, it was psychological, too. My mind began to race with strange thoughts. Was I the only one who had ever sat in this chair? Or had someone else, someone I couldn't remember, used it before? I reached down and pulled the throw blanket from the back of the chair, trying to insulate myself from the cold, but it didn't help. The cold seemed to seep through everything, like it had settled deep into the fabric, into the very bones of the chair itself. The feeling was almost suffocating, as though I couldn't escape it no matter how hard I tried. The longer I sat there, the more I felt like something was watching me. The feeling crept up slowly at first, but soon it became overwhelming. I couldn't shake the thought that something was lurking just outside my field of vision, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I kept glancing around the room, half expecting to see a shadow moving in the corner of my eye, but there was nothing. The room was quiet still, and yet the sense of unease refused to leave. I stood up, abruptly leaving the chair behind, and paced the room. I needed to do something, anything to break the strange hold the chair had over me. I couldn't understand why it was affecting me so much. It was just a chair after all. Yet in that moment it felt as though it was more than just a piece of furniture. It felt like an anchor to something dark, something I couldn't see but could almost feel pressing against me. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and scrolled through the screen absently, trying to distract myself from the tension in the air. But the coldness of the chair lingered in my mind even as I attempted to focus on something else. The weight of it was almost suffocating. I couldn't shake the image of the chair sitting there waiting for me to return, as though it was holding something from the past, something I couldn't remember. The longer I stayed in the room, the more the air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were closing in. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. This was ridiculous. There was nothing unusual about the chair, and there was certainly nothing sinister about it. I had to remind myself of this over and over, but the nagging feeling didn't go away. The coldness, the unease, the sense of something watching it all seemed to tie back to that one chair. I glanced at the clock. It was late, far later than I had realized. The room was dark except for the dim glow of my phone, and the silence was only broken by the occasional sound of cars passing outside. I felt the urge to leave the room, to walk away from the chair, and the odd feeling that seemed to cling to it. But something inside me told me that if I left, I would only be running from whatever was haunting me. With a deep breath, I walked back to the chair and sat down, this time determined to face whatever was making me feel so uneasy. The coldness hit me immediately, sharper than before. But this time I tried to focus on it, to understand why it was affecting me so much. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to feel the chill, not letting it control me. As I sat there in the uncomfortable silence, I began to notice something strange. The longer I stayed still, the more the coldness seemed to dissipate. It wasn't gone entirely, but it lessened, and with it, the oppressive weight of the room seemed to lift slightly. Maybe, I thought, it wasn't the chair itself that was the source of the unease, it was me. My own thoughts, my own fear had magnified something that wasn't really there. When I finally stood up again, I felt a strange sense of relief. The chair no longer felt like an anchor to something dark. It simply felt like a chair. I turned off the lights and went to bed, the events of the night slowly fading into the background. But even as I lay there, trying to sleep, I couldn't shake the memory of the coldness, of how real it had felt. The next morning, when I returned to the living room, the chair was just as it always was. It was warm from the morning sun streaming through the window, inviting me to sit once again. But part of me hesitated, the memory of the coldness still lingering in the back of my mind. Story 18. It was a sunny afternoon, and I had just finished running errands. I walked back to my car, ready to head home and relax after a busy day. The parking lot was fairly empty, with only a few other vehicles scattered around. I unlocked the car door, slid into the driver's seat, and began to pull the seatbelt over my shoulder. That's when I noticed something on the windshield, a small slip of paper, slightly crumpled, as though it had been hastily placed there. Curious, I reached out and grabbed the receipt. At first, it seemed like any other receipt you might find after a trip to the store. But when I looked closer, my stomach dropped. The store listed on the receipt was one I had never visited. It was in a part of town I rarely drove through, and the items listed were things I didn't recognize at all. I turned the paper over, hoping to see some indication of an error, or perhaps a mistaken identity. But nothing. The receipt was dated earlier that morning, hours before I had even left my house. I held the receipt in my hands, staring at it in disbelief. The total wasn't small either. There were several items listed, including a pair of shoes and a bag of groceries. Nothing on that list had any connection to me. The total, the items, the store, everything about it seemed completely foreign. I had been home that morning, working from the kitchen table, so there was no way I could have been at that store. And even if I had somehow forgotten about it, why would this receipt end up on my car? My mind raced with possibilities. Could it have been a mix-up? Maybe someone had accidentally put it on my car by mistake. But it didn't make sense. The receipt wasn't just a random slip of paper, it was for a specific time, place, and purchase. Someone had made those choices, someone had bought those things, and somehow it was connected to my car. But how? And why? I got out of the car, looking around the parking lot for anyone who might have left the receipt there. The lot was still mostly empty, with just a few people walking to their cars or heading into the nearby buildings. I didn't recognize anyone, and none of them seemed to be paying attention to me. No one was looking my way. There was no one I could ask if they knew anything about the receipt. I felt a chill run down my spine. I glanced back at the receipt, my fingers trembling slightly as I held it. My first thought was to throw it away, to forget about it, to pretend nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This wasn't just a harmless mix-up, it felt like a message, or worse, a sign that someone knew something about me that I didn't. But what could that be? I decided to call the store. Maybe they could confirm if there had been a mistake, or if someone had somehow used my information to make the purchase. I dialed the number printed at the bottom of the receipt, trying to stay calm. The phone rang several times before someone finally picked up. "Hello, thank you for calling. Store name. How can I help you?" I hesitated for a moment, wondering how to explain the situation without sounding completely paranoid. "Hi, I was just wondering if you could help me with something," I said, my voice slightly shaky. "I found a receipt on my windshield for a purchase made at your store earlier today. The items listed on it, I've never bought them." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before the employee responded. "I'm sorry. Let me check the transaction for you." Could you give me the receipt number?" I gave them the number, waiting anxiously as they checked. My heart pounded in my chest, and I glanced over my shoulder again, half expecting someone to be watching me from a distance. After what felt like an eternity, the employee came back on the line. "Thank you for your patience. I've checked our records, and it appears that the transaction was completed under your name," they said, their tone professional but confused. "Is there a chance you made the purchase and forgot about it?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "No," I said, my voice firm now. "I didn't make that purchase. I've never been to your store, let alone bought anything there today." The employee seemed to hesitate. "I'm sorry for the confusion, but the receipt is showing your name, and the purchase was made using your credit card." I felt my blood run cold. How could this be happening? I hadn't been to that store, I hadn't bought anything, and I certainly hadn't used my credit card there. There was no way to explain it. I thanked the employee and hung up, my mind spinning as I tried to make sense of the situation. I decided to check my bank account immediately. I logged into my online banking, my heart racing as I scrolled through the recent transactions. My eyes scanned the list, looking for any unusual charges. And there it was. A charge from the same store, for the exact amount listed on the receipt. My stomach twisted in knots. I quickly called my bank, explaining the situation as best as I could. They promised to investigate, but I couldn't help feeling like something was slipping further and further out of my control. How could this happen? I was sure I hadn't made the purchase, and yet there was a record of it on my bank account, linked to my credit card. As the hours passed, I found myself spiraling into a state of constant anxiety. I didn't feel safe in my own car, didn't feel secure with my own credit card. Someone had made a purchase in my name, and now there was a physical receipt, a piece of evidence that tied it all together. It felt like I was being watched, like someone had gone to great lengths to make sure I knew what they had done. But who would do something like this? And why? I spent the rest of the day trying to calm my nerves, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The receipt kept popping into my mind, the items, the store, the charge on my bank statement. The pieces didn't fit together, and no matter how much I tried to reason with myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, someone who knew far too much about me. And now, as I lay in bed that night, I still couldn't shake the thought that this was just the beginning, that there was more to this strange, unsettling situation than I could possibly understand. What did they want from me, and how far would they go? Story 19. I woke up to the familiar buzz of my smartwatch on my wrist, the alert flashing across the screen in bold letters. Heart rate spiked at 4 a.m. The first thing I thought was that it was a glitch, some malfunction or misreading. I checked the time still early, just after 6 a.m., and tried to shake off the unease that was beginning to settle in. It was possible that I had been dreaming or tossing and turning during the night, and the watch had misinterpreted it. But something about the timing felt off, and I couldn't ignore the strange feeling that was creeping over me. I tried to remember what had happened the night before, but my mind was foggy. I didn't recall waking up at 4 a.m. or even feeling anything unusual while I was asleep. I had fallen asleep exhausted, my body aching from a long day, and I didn't think I had stirred at all during the night. Yet, according to the smartwatch, my heart rate had spiked for some unknown reason. It was unsettling. I reached for my phone and pulled up the detailed data from the alert. The heart rate had climbed dangerously high, way beyond what should have been possible during a normal night's sleep. I felt a wave of panic hit me as I stared at the screen. There was no obvious explanation. I had not been exercising, nor had I consumed anything that would have caused my heart rate to increase. The room had been quiet and dark, the kind of peaceful night I had grown used to. So, what had triggered it? I thought about checking my blood pressure or making a call to my doctor. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something more than just a physical anomaly was at play here. There had been no warning signs in my life, no reason to believe I was experiencing a health issue. Yet, this alert felt too specific to ignore. I sat there for a while, contemplating the possibilities. Could I have been experiencing a nightmare, one so vivid it caused my body to react physically? It seemed unlikely I didn't recall any dreams, let alone anything that could trigger such an intense physiological response. The thought that I might have had some kind of anxiety attack in my sleep crossed my mind, but I quickly dismissed it. I hadn't been feeling anxious lately, nor had I experienced any sort of stress that would explain the alert. As I sat in bed, trying to make sense of the situation, I glanced around the room. Everything seemed normal, nothing out of place, no strange sounds or movements that would explain the spike. The window was closed, the air still, and there was nothing in my environment that should have caused a physiological response like that. And yet the alert on my smartwatch was undeniable. My heart rate had spiked at exactly 4 a.m. and I couldn't explain why. The more I thought about it, the more a strange feeling began to take hold of me. I hadn't heard anything unusual during the night, no noises or disturbances. I had fallen asleep in complete silence, and everything had felt calm and safe. But that sudden spike in heart rate at such a specific time made me question whether something had happened, something I hadn't been aware of. I tried to reassure myself that it was probably nothing, just a random occurrence, a glitch in the system. But deep down, a part of me wondered if something more sinister was at play. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something important. Had someone been in my room while I was asleep? The thought made my skin crawl, but I quickly dismissed it. I would have heard someone moving around, right? I had a habit of waking up easily, especially if there were any noises. But then again, I had been asleep. Maybe I hadn't heard anything at all. Maybe someone had been there, just out of sight. My mind raced, and I couldn't stop thinking about the alert. I hadn't felt any physical signs of stress when I woke up, no chest pains or shortness of breath, which made me believe it wasn't a medical issue. But the alarm from my smartwatch felt more like a warning, something that demanded my attention. I decided to check my security cameras just to be sure. I had a couple set up around the house for peace of mind, and I wanted to see if there was any movement during the night. I pulled up the footage for the past few hours and started fast-forwarding through it, my eyes glued to the screen. Everything seemed calm. There were no shadows moving, no sudden flashes of light. But then, right around 4 a.m., something strange happened. A figure appeared briefly in the frame, a shadow darting past the window, too quick for me to get a clear look. My heart skipped a beat as I rewound the footage and played it again. The figure was barely visible, almost as if they were moving too fast to catch clearly. It was impossible to make out any details, but the timing was impossible to ignore. My mind raced as I watched the footage again. Could it have been someone walking by? A car's headlights catching the window at just the right angle? Maybe, but the more I watched, the more I was convinced that it wasn't a coincidence. The figure's movement had been too deliberate, almost as if it had been waiting for the exact moment my heart rate spiked. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Was someone outside my house at that exact time, watching me while I slept? Had they somehow triggered my smartwatch, causing it to register the heart rate spike? It seemed like a stretch, but the possibility lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was probably just my imagination running wild. The footage didn't provide enough evidence to jump to any conclusions, but the timing was too strange to ignore. My heart rate had spiked exactly at the same time the figure appeared on camera. I tried to make sense of it all, but the more I thought about it, the more confused and uneasy I became. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the house, every shadow seemed to carry an extra weight. I double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows, but it didn't bring me any comfort. I knew I couldn't just ignore what had happened. Something strange had occurred in the middle of the night, and I couldn't explain it. I spent the rest of the morning looking through more footage, but there were no other unusual occurrences. Just that one moment, that one fleeting shadow. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the authorities? Tell them about the figure on the footage and the heart rate alert? I didn't even know what I was asking for. What could they do with so little to go on? The footage was vague at best, and the heart rate spike could have been a mistake. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Whoever or whatever had triggered my smartwatch at 4 a.m. was still out there, and the thought of it made me feel more vulnerable than ever. Story 20. N. It happened on a chilly evening. The kind of night where the air seemed to cling to your skin and your breath hung in the air in tiny clouds. I had just finished a late meeting and was hurrying to catch a cab back to my apartment. The streets were quieter than usual, the city's usual hustle and bustle softened by the approaching winter chill. I stood by the curb, watching as a few cabs passed, none stopping. After a few minutes, one pulled up to the curb with the creak of its brakes. I climbed in without hesitation, eager to get out of the cold. The cab driver greeted me with a friendly smile as I slid into the back seat, the warm air inside the car a welcome contrast to the night's chill. I gave him the address, and he nodded, pulling away from the curb. As we drove through the quiet streets, the cab's headlights cutting through the darkness, I relaxed for a moment, staring out the window. The city looked different at night, the buildings looming like silent giants in the distance, their lights twinkling in the darkness. "So how's your night been?" the driver asked after a few moments of silence. His voice was warm, a casual, friendly tone that didn't strike me as unusual. I responded, telling him it had been a long day, but I was glad it was finally over. The driver chuckled, and then, unexpectedly, he said something that made my heart skip a beat. "You know," he began, glancing at me through the rearview mirror, "I recognize you. You look just like someone I met in Denver a few years ago." I froze, my mind stalling as I processed his words. Denver. I had never been to Denver. In fact, I had never even set foot in Colorado. I had no reason to go there, no reason to have ever been there. I opened my mouth, but for a moment, I couldn't find the words to respond. How could he recognize me from a place I'd never visited? I cleared my throat and asked, trying to keep my voice steady, "I've never been to Denver." The driver seemed unfazed by my response, though, and continued as if he hadn't heard me. "Yeah, you really do look like this person I met there. Same smile, same eyes. Funny, right? It's like I've seen you before." I couldn't make sense of it. My mind was racing, trying to grasp at some logical explanation. Maybe he was just mistaken, confusing me with someone else, someone who happened to look like me. Or maybe it was just a strange coincidence, though the idea of coincidences like this happening so randomly made my skin crawl. I forced myself to speak again, trying to sound casual, even though I could feel the unease creeping into my chest. "I'm sure I've never been to Denver," I said, my voice sounding a bit more unsure than I intended. I've never even had the chance to visit Colorado. The driver nodded, though he didn't seem entirely convinced. He glanced at me again, his expression thoughtful. "Well, maybe I'm just imagining things," he said, a small chuckle escaping his lips. "You just look so familiar, but that's probably just me." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. The rest of the ride passed in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional click of the turn signal. My mind was spinning, unable to let go of what he had said. I couldn't shake the thought that he had recognized me from a place I had never been, and it left me with a strange, uncomfortable feeling. When we finally arrived at my apartment, I paid the fare and climbed out of the cab. I glanced back at the driver, who was still sitting in his seat, his gaze fixed on me. He gave me a friendly wave as I closed the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stood there for a moment, watching the cab drive away, my heart still pounding in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just an odd encounter, nothing more. Maybe he had mistaken me for someone else. Maybe he was just trying to make conversation. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't something as simple as a misunderstanding. I felt like there was something more to it, something I couldn't quite grasp. The next few days passed, and I tried to put the strange encounter out of my mind. Life went on as usual, and I kept myself busy with work and the usual routines. But every now and then, when I was walking through the streets or sitting in a cafe, I'd catch myself glancing around, half expecting to see the cab driver somewhere nearby. It was as if his words had planted a seed of doubt in my mind, a suspicion that something was wrong. One evening, as I was heading home from work, I found myself passing through a neighborhood I didn't recognize. It wasn't far from where I lived, but it felt different, somehow quiet, empty, almost abandoned. I stopped for a moment, unsure of what drew me to that particular street, but as I stood there, a sense of unease crept over me. I turned around to leave, but before I could take a step, something caught my eye. Across the street, standing under the dim light of a street lamp, was a man. I couldn't make out his features from that distance, but something about the way he stood motionless, staring at me, sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The man didn't move, didn't even blink. It was as though he was waiting for something. I quickly turned and walked in the opposite direction, my mind racing. Was it him? The cab driver? It couldn't be. But the feeling, the unsettling sense of recognition, the way he had looked at me in the cab, made my pulse race. I didn't dare look back, not until I reached the safety of my apartment. When I finally made it inside, I locked the door behind me and sat down on the couch, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But the words of the cab driver echoed in my mind. "I recognize you." What did that mean? And why did it feel like I was being pulled into something that didn't make sense? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had somehow missed something, if there was something I was supposed to remember, something that linked me to that man, to the cab driver, to the street I had passed by. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. The next few weeks felt like a blur. I continued with my usual routines, but the encounter with the cab driver haunted me. It was as if his words had unraveled something deep inside me, something that I couldn't put back together. Every time I stepped out of my apartment, I found myself scanning the streets, looking for something, anything that might give me an answer. But I never saw him again. Story 21. I arrived at the hotel after a long day of traveling. The lobby was quiet, the faint sound of elevator music playing in the background. I checked in without incident, my mind focused on getting some rest after a hectic trip. The clerk handed me the key, and I made my way to the elevator, the doors sliding open with a soft chime. I could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing on me as I ascended to my floor, hoping for a peaceful night. The room was small but clean, with a comfortable-looking bed and a desk near the window. I placed my suitcase on the bed, ready to unpack, when I noticed something strange. The light above the desk flickered as I entered the room, briefly dimming before returning to its usual brightness. I didn't think much of it at first. Old hotels sometimes had odd lighting quirks. I brushed it off, thinking that I'd simply need to adjust the bulb if it became a recurring issue. I unpacked my things, placing my clothes in the drawers and setting up my laptop on the desk. As I reached up to turn off the light, I noticed the bulb itself seemed a little too polished. It looked newer than the rest of the fixtures in the room, which was odd considering the hotel's age. My curiosity piqued, I leaned closer to inspect it. There was something off about the way it was screwed into the socket, almost like it didn't belong there. I hesitated for a moment, but decided to investigate further. I twisted the bulb carefully, pulling it free from the socket. When I did, something fell out of it, landing with a small clink on the desk. I blinked, unsure of what I had just heard. I picked up the object, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. It was a tiny black camera. My mind raced as I turned the object over in my hand. It was small, so small and sleek, almost like it had been custom made to fit inside the light bulb. I dropped the camera onto the desk, stepping back in shock. The room suddenly felt a lot less safe, the walls seeming to close in on me. Why would there be a hidden camera inside the light bulb in my hotel room? I scanned the room, my eyes darting from corner to corner, my thoughts spinning. Could it be that I wasn't alone in this room? That someone had been watching me? The question made my skin crawl, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I thought back to the moment when I first entered the room. The lighting had flickered briefly, almost like a signal. Was someone watching me, waiting for me to make a move? Or was I simply overreacting to a strange coincidence? But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The camera had been placed there deliberately. Someone had been watching me. My first instinct was to call the front desk, but I hesitated. What if they were involved? What if they were in on it? The thought made my stomach churn. I didn't want to alert anyone who might be part of whatever was happening. I considered leaving the hotel, but the thought of walking into the lobby with that camera in my hand, not knowing who I could trust, made me feel exposed. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for the front desk. The line rang several times before it was answered by a pleasant-sounding voice. "Good evening. This is the front desk. How can I help you?" I tried to keep my voice steady, but I couldn't help the tremble that slipped through. I'm in room 314, and I found something strange in my light bulb. It's a camera, and I'm not sure why it's there. Can you send someone up?" There was a brief pause on the other end, and then the voice responded, "I'm sorry, but I'm afraid we don't have any staff available at this hour. Is there anything else I can help you with?" The lack of urgency in their response sent a wave of unease through me. Why wasn't there any concern in their voice? I repeated my request, my tone now sharper, but the clerk merely reiterated that no one could help me right away. I hung up in frustration, my mind racing. Something was definitely wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being targeted. I knew I had to leave, but I didn't want to make a scene. I grabbed the camera and stuffed it into my bag, then quickly packed up the rest of my things. I wanted out of that hotel, away from the sense of danger that seemed to linger in the air. But as I turned to leave, I stopped at the door. What if they were watching me now? What if they knew I had discovered the camera? I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was waiting for me to make the wrong move. I turned back toward the window, my mind racing for a way to escape without drawing attention to myself. I considered climbing down the fire escape, but that seemed too risky. I didn't know who was watching or what they might do if they saw me try to leave. The more I thought about it, the more paranoid I became. I couldn't stay in that room, but I also couldn't just walk out of the hotel like nothing had happened. I needed help, but I didn't know who to turn to. Everyone at the front desk seemed unbothered by my situation, and I had no idea who else to trust. I paced the room, feeling trapped. I thought about contacting the police, but I wasn't sure if they would take me seriously. What if they thought I was overreacting? I looked at the camera in my bag again, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I was simply imagining things. But the reality of it settled in. I had found a hidden camera in my hotel room. Someone had been watching me, and that was something I couldn't ignore. After what felt like hours, I made the decision to leave. I couldn't stay there another minute. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, but as I opened it, I froze. There was someone standing in the hallway. A man in a dark suit, his face unreadable. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me. My heart raced, and I quickly shut the door, locking it behind me. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I backed away from the door, my mind whirling. What was going on? Why had he been standing there? Was he part of the setup? The questions flooded my thoughts, and I had no answers. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that room any longer. It was no longer a safe place. I took the camera from my bag and tossed it in the trash. I wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but it felt like the only thing I could do to protect myself. I didn't know what the camera had captured or who had been watching, but I didn't want to keep it any longer. I turned and left the room, walking quickly to the stairs instead of the elevator. I didn't want to risk running into anyone else who might be involved. As I descended the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every step I took seemed to echo in the silence of the hotel, and I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breathing. I reached the lobby and pushed open the door, stepping out into the cool night air. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I walked down the street, away from the hotel, unsure of what to do next. The image of the man in the hallway haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. The hotel, once just a place to rest, had turned into a nightmare, and I wasn't sure if I would ever feel safe again. Story 22. At first I thought it was just a strange glitch. I had been texting a friend, joking about our plans for the weekend, when my phone suddenly changed sounds fun to danger sounds fun. I stared at the screen, unsure of what had just happened. My first instinct was to undo the autocorrection, but as I tapped the screen, I noticed that the word danger wasn't just a one-off mistake. It had been inserted into nearly every text I'd sent that evening, almost as if my phone was insisting on it. I quickly sent a follow-up message to my friend, just to clear things up. I typed, "Can't wait for the trip," and hit send, but my phone did it again. The message came through as, "Can't wait for the danger trip." I stared at the screen, confused. I typed it again, slower this time, making sure to double-check each word before sending. "I'll be there at 8. And once again my phone changed it to "I'll be there at danger 8. This wasn't just some autocorrect feature going awry. It felt deliberate, like my phone had suddenly developed its own personality. I tried turning off autocorrect altogether, but the words still appeared, even though the predictive text feature was turned off. I opened a new message and typed, "How are you?" This time, my phone altered it to "How danger are you?" A chill ran down my spine as I considered what could be causing this. Was I just imagining it? Maybe I had pressed something by accident, some hidden setting that caused this bizarre behavior. I went into my phone's settings, checked the language, and made sure that everything looked normal. But there was nothing. I even tried resetting my phone to its factory settings, hoping that would clear whatever was causing the issue. But when the phone restarted and I sent a simple hello text, it came through as "Danger hello." It was then that I began to feel a knot form in my stomach. This wasn't just a simple inconvenience anymore. I couldn't explain it. The word danger kept cropping up like an unwanted guest in my messages, and the more I tried to get rid of it, the more persistent it became. I decided to call my friend and explain what was happening. As I dialed the number, I felt a sense of urgency. I wanted someone to know that something was wrong, but the call didn't go through. The phone rang and rang before the line went silent. Confused, I tried again. Same result. I checked my signal, it was fine. I tried calling other people, but no one picked up, as if they were deliberately avoiding me. My anxiety began to rise. Was it just coincidence? I tried sending a message to another friend, just to test if the issue was with my phone or something else. I typed, "Do you want to meet up?" The message was autocorrected to "Do you want to danger up?" At this point, my nerves were completely frayed. I felt as though something unseen was playing a twisted game with me. It wasn't just about the autocorrections anymore. It was about the word itself. The word danger kept invading every text, creating an unsettling sense of impending doom. I began to wonder if it was more than just a glitch. Was I being warned? Maybe I was overthinking it, but there was something about this situation that felt off. Why was this word appearing everywhere I typed? And why was it appearing so specifically? Every time I tried to compose a message, danger slipped its way in, as though I couldn't escape it. I looked at my phone, the screen dimly lit in the dark of my room. What should I do? I couldn't stop the feeling of unease creeping up my spine, and the constant appearance of the word made everything feel surreal. I opened the messaging app again and tried typing something completely unrelated, something innocuous like "Good morning." But sure enough, the message was changed to "Danger morning." I stood up, pacing around my living room. Was someone hacking my phone? I quickly checked all my apps and scanned for anything unusual, but everything appeared normal. I even tried uninstalling apps I didn't recognize. Still, the autocorrections kept happening. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but I could feel my pulse quickening. I felt trapped, unable to escape this strange phenomenon. As the hours passed, I began receiving notifications, texts, calls, and emails from people I hadn't spoken to in a while. Strangely though, the messages they sent weren't exactly what I expected. Some of them simply said danger and nothing else. Others said things like "Watch out for danger" or "Be careful, danger is coming." I stared at the screen in disbelief. These weren't normal messages. They were direct, unsettling, and I couldn't make sense of them. I had no idea who was sending them, and when I tried replying, my texts once again turned into strange warnings. "I don't trust anyone" was turned into "Danger, trust anyone." I finally decided to turn off my phone, hoping that the silence would stop the onslaught of strange messages. But when I picked it back up an hour later, I was greeted by a new text notification. It read, "You should have listened. Danger is real." The words struck me like a punch to the gut. I could no longer ignore it. This wasn't just a malfunction. I searched online hoping to find someone else who had experienced anything similar. But as I scrolled through various forums and discussions, I found nothing. There were no reports of this exact issue, and nothing about the word danger showing up in texts uninvited. I wondered if I was going crazy. Was it just me? I had to know more. I decided to visit a phone repair shop the next day, hoping a technician could fix whatever was going on. But when I walked in and showed the technician my phone, he paused as he looked at it. Without saying a word, he swiped through the messages I had been receiving, his face growing more concerned by the second. "This is odd," he said quietly. "I've never seen anything like this before." I asked if he could help, but he shook his head. "I don't know what's causing this. I'm afraid it's beyond my expertise. Maybe you should take it to a specialist." I left the shop, feeling no closer to understanding what was happening. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed. Another text: "You can't avoid it. Danger is everywhere." Story 23. I had just come home after a long day at work, feeling tired but looking forward to a quiet evening at home. The house was still, with only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my footsteps echoing through the hall. As I walked toward the kitchen, I noticed something odd on the doorstep: a package. It was sitting there, just to the side of the door, as if someone had deliberately placed it out of sight from the street. I picked it up, puzzled. It was a small, nondescript box wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no return address, no label, nothing to indicate who had sent it or what might be inside. The only thing written on it was my name, neatly printed in black ink. I hadn't ordered anything, so why was it here? A sense of unease crept over me as I stood there, holding the box. I looked up and down the street, but the neighborhood was quiet, with no one in sight. I set the package down on the kitchen counter and inspected it more closely. It didn't have the usual shipping labels or stamps you'd expect from a delivery. It was as though someone had dropped it off personally, and yet I couldn't imagine who would do such a thing. My first thought was that it was a mistake, maybe a package meant for someone else, but when I checked the name again, it was definitely mine. I felt a pang of uncertainty. There was no note, no card, no explanation, just this mysterious package. I wondered if I should open it, or if I was being paranoid. It could be harmless, just a mix-up, but something about it didn't feel right. The absence of any clue about its origin made it even more unsettling. I stood there for a moment, debating what to do. I decided to call my neighbor, thinking perhaps they might have some insight. Maybe they had seen someone drop it off, or perhaps there had been a delivery mix-up. As I reached for my phone, I felt a chill in the air, as if the temperature in the room had dropped. My mind was racing with questions, none of which I could answer. Why would anyone send me a package without any information, and who would deliver it in such an anonymous way? I dialed my neighbor's number and waited for them to pick up. After a few rings, they answered. "Hello," they said, sounding a little groggy. "Hey, it's me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I just got a package delivered to my doorstep, but I don't know what it is or who sent it. Did you see anyone around?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "No," my neighbor finally replied. "I haven't seen anyone drop anything off. Are you sure it's for you?" I looked at the package again, feeling my anxiety build. Yes, it's addressed to me, but there's no return address. Nothing. It just showed up out of nowhere. "Well, that's strange," my neighbor said, their voice laced with concern. "Maybe you should call the delivery service to check. It doesn't sound right." I thanked them and ended the call, my mind now even more unsettled than before. What was going on? Why would someone send me something in such a strange and secretive way? I didn't want to just toss it out, not without knowing what was inside. At the same time, the idea of opening it made me uneasy. What if it was something dangerous, something meant to intimidate me? I finally took a deep breath and decided to open the package. Carefully, I sliced through the tape, each movement slow and deliberate. The moment I peeled back the paper, I was met with a small, black velvet box. My heart skipped a beat. It was elegant and simple, but its very appearance seemed to add weight to the mystery. There was no indication of what it might contain, no clue at all. I hesitated before opening the box. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the lid, revealing a small, folded piece of paper tucked inside. I pulled it out, unfolding it with caution. The handwriting on the paper was neat but unfamiliar. It read, "You've been noticed. Watch your step." My blood ran cold. The words were chilling in their simplicity, yet their meaning was anything but. The message seemed like a warning, but a warning for what? Who had sent it, and why? I felt a rising sense of dread, as if I had unknowingly walked into something I wasn't meant to see. I looked back at the box, now empty except for the note. My hands were shaking as I set it down on the counter. The silence in the house felt deafening, the air thick with tension. I was beginning to feel like I was being watched, that there was something lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to figure it out. I picked up my phone again, this time to call the police. I didn't know what else to do. A mysterious package, a threatening message. It all felt like the start of something bigger, something I couldn't quite grasp. But just as I was about to dial, a thought struck me. Had I seen anyone around the neighborhood earlier? Was there any sign that someone had been here, near my house, at any point today? I couldn't recall anything specific, just the usual peaceful routine. But then again, how could I have missed something like that? My eyes darted back to the package. The absence of any clear answers was maddening. I didn't feel safe, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had sent it knew something about me, something I wasn't aware of. I placed the note back in the box, closed the lid, and decided to lock the door behind me. Maybe I was overreacting, maybe it was nothing. But deep down I knew that this wasn't just a simple mistake or a harmless gift. It was something more. Something that made me feel as though I had just unknowingly stepped into a much larger and more dangerous picture. Story 24. It was an ordinary morning when I sat down at my desk to start working. The familiar hum of my computer powered on, the screen lighting up as I logged into my account. I went about my usual routine, checking emails and preparing for the tasks ahead. But as I settled in, something caught my eye. The wallpaper on my computer had changed. I stared at the screen, bewildered. The image was of my neighborhood at night, an eerily calm view of the street I lived on. I hadn't set that as my wallpaper. In fact, I had a different image, a peaceful landscape of mountains that I had always kept as my background. But now, instead of the usual serenity, my screen displayed a picture of my very own surroundings, illuminated by streetlights and the shadows of houses. My heart began to race. How had this happened? I checked the settings, convinced I had accidentally clicked something that changed the wallpaper. But there was nothing in my recent activity that could explain it. The wallpaper was completely different from the one I had selected, and I hadn't downloaded any new images recently. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself that it was probably some kind of glitch. After all, computers can be unpredictable sometimes. But the more I stared at the image, the more uneasy I felt. There was something unsettling about seeing my neighborhood so clearly on my screen, especially at night. It felt too personal, too intrusive. I decided to search through my computer for any trace of how the wallpaper had changed. I opened the folder where I usually stored pictures and wallpapers, but it was empty. There were no recent files, no downloads. I couldn't figure out where the photo had come from. A thought crossed my mind: had someone accessed my computer without my knowledge? I quickly checked my recent login activity, but everything seemed normal. No unfamiliar logins, no signs that anyone had been using my computer. Still, the sense of unease lingered. I couldn't help but look at the photo again, analyzing every detail. The houses were familiar, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. I recognized the exact angle of the photo, the position of my neighbor's car parked near the curb. But there was one detail that sent a chill down my spine: the figure in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But as I zoomed in, I saw that there was a shadowy figure standing near one of the houses. It was hard to make out, but the shape appeared to be standing still, almost as if watching the street. My pulse quickened as I stared at the figure. I shook my head, trying to brush off the thought. It had to be a coincidence. After all, the neighborhood was always busy at night with people walking dogs or coming home late. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned off the computer, hoping that stepping away from it would help me feel better. But the image of the figure in the photo lingered in my mind. The next morning, I checked my computer again, and the same photo of my neighborhood was still set as the wallpaper. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I began to wonder if someone had been watching me, somehow taking that photo without me knowing. Maybe it had been taken while I was away from home, or worse, while I was inside, oblivious to the person outside. The thought was too unsettling to bear, and I found myself constantly looking out the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of anyone suspicious. I went through my security cameras, checking the footage from the past few days, but there was nothing unusual on the recordings. No one had approached my house, no strange figures in the yard. The streets were quiet, just as they always were at night, yet the photo on my screen felt real, too real. Days passed, and I continued to check my computer regularly. I even changed the wallpaper back to my original landscape photo, but the nighttime neighborhood image always reappeared after a few hours. It was as if the photo had a mind of its own, returning again and again despite my efforts to remove it. I began to feel trapped, as though my privacy had been invaded in a way I couldn't explain. Every time I opened my laptop, the photo was there, staring back at me. I couldn't tell if it was some kind of malicious prank or if there was something more sinister at play. I asked my friends and family if they had any idea how it could have happened, but they were just as puzzled as I was. No one could think of a reason why that particular image would appear on my computer, let alone how it kept returning. I considered taking my computer to a technician, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more than just a technical issue at play. Then, one evening, I was sitting at my desk when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The same figure from the photo was standing outside my window. I froze, staring at the shadowy outline in the distance. My heart thudded in my chest as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. I rushed to the window, but by the time I looked outside, there was no one there. The street was empty, the only sound being the distant hum of traffic. I couldn't explain what I had seen, but the connection to the figure in the photo was undeniable. The experience left me on edge. I didn't know who had taken the photo or why it had been sent to my computer. I still don't know the answer to that question, and every day I wonder if the figure in the image was just a coincidence or something more. All I know is that my computer wallpaper changed one day, and it set off a chain of events that I haven't been able to unravel. Story 25. I found a message written in chalk on my driveway that read, "Welcome home." The words were simple, but they carried an unsettling weight. It was an ordinary message, one that would usually make someone feel welcome, but something about it felt off. The handwriting was strange, almost hurried, as if someone had quickly scribbled it just before I arrived. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned the surroundings, half expecting to find someone watching me from the shadows, but the street was empty, quiet as usual. The faint smell of chalk mixed with the fresh air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I hesitated for a moment, standing there at the edge of my driveway, staring at the words. There was no reason for anyone to leave such a message, no reason for anyone to be in my yard. I lived alone, and this wasn't something I would have done. Who would write this here, and why? It wasn't just the message itself that was strange, it was the timing. I had only been away for a few hours, running errands, nothing out of the ordinary. So how had someone gotten into my driveway and written it without me noticing? A part of me wanted to dismiss it as a prank, but another part of me felt like something deeper was at play. I crouched down to get a closer look at the message, my eyes scanning for any unusual marks or signs. The chalk was still fresh, but there were no fingerprints or smudges around the edges. It was as if whoever had written it had been careful, deliberate. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made any sense. I looked down the street, searching for anyone who might have seen something, but the neighborhood was silent. The only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I didn't know what to do with the message. It felt like a warning, but for what? The first thing I did was check my front door. I quickly walked up to it, half expecting to find it unlocked or ajar, but everything was as it should be. I turned the handle, and the door opened smoothly, the familiar creak of the hinges reassuring me that nothing had been tampered with. My anxiety didn't lessen, though. If someone had been in my driveway, they could have been inside as well. I took a few cautious steps into the house, looking around the entryway for any signs that something was out of place. The living room was the same as I had left it, and there was no evidence of any disturbance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was waiting for me to discover something I didn't yet understand. The message on the driveway lingered in my mind, repeating itself like a loop. Welcome home. It felt too personal, too specific, as though someone had been expecting me. But who? And why would they choose this moment to leave such a cryptic message? I tried to shake off the unease and went about my day, but it was difficult to concentrate on anything. The message haunted me, following me from room to room, and no matter what I did, I couldn't ignore it. Every time I glanced out the window or walked past the door, I expected to see someone standing there watching. I checked the security cameras around my property, hoping to find something that would explain the message. But the footage from earlier that day showed nothing out of the ordinary. No one had approached my house. No one had been near my driveway. It didn't make sense. The message had appeared out of nowhere, and I had no answers. As the days passed, I became increasingly paranoid. I started to question everything. Had I missed something? Had someone been watching me for longer than I realized? It was hard to ignore the fact that the message seemed specifically tailored to me. Welcome home. It was as if someone had known I would be returning at that exact moment. The longer I thought about it, the more it seemed like a signal, a marker of some kind. But what was it marking? And why was it aimed at me? I began to wonder if it was connected to something I had overlooked. I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary before I left that morning, but maybe there was something I had missed. Perhaps the message was a warning, or worse, an invitation to something I wasn't prepared for. I thought about my neighbors and whether any of them might have seen anything unusual, but whenever I asked, They all seemed oblivious to anything out of the ordinary. It was as if the message was meant just for me, and no one else. As the weeks went by, the feeling of unease didn't fade. In fact, it only grew stronger. The message remained in the back of my mind, an unsettling reminder that something was wrong. I started noticing more things around my house that didn't add up. Small details, objects moved slightly out of place, the feeling that I was being watched when I was home alone, and the constant sense that I wasn't in control of my own space. It felt like someone was creeping into my life, leaving these subtle clues that I was too blind to see. One day I received a letter in the mail. It was an unmarked envelope, the handwriting on it unfamiliar. Inside there was a single sheet of paper with one line written on it, "You're not alone." I froze as I read the words. The message seemed to confirm what I had been feeling all along. I wasn't alone. But who else was there? And why had they been leaving these messages for me? The letter only deepened the mystery, raising more questions than it answered. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to figure out who was behind it and what they wanted from me. I went back to the driveway, hoping to find some new clue, some sign that would explain everything. But the message was still there, faded slightly from the rain but still legible. "Welcome home." The words had taken on a new meaning. They were no longer just a strange greeting. They were a message that had been waiting for me, waiting for this moment. But I didn't know how to respond. How do you respond to something like this? How do you even begin to understand a message that seems to come from nowhere? The uncertainty lingered, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I might never get the answers I was looking for. Someone had been in my life leaving these cryptic messages, and I had no idea who they were or why they were doing it. The only thing I knew for certain was that my life had changed the moment I found that message on my driveway. Whatever was happening, I had no control over it anymore. It was already too late to turn back. Story 26. I sat down at my desk one evening, preparing to work on a few tasks when I noticed something strange. My email inbox, which I had checked just the night before, contained an unread message. There was nothing unusual about the subject line, but when I opened it, my heart sank. It was a draft, but not one I had written. The sender's field was empty, and the recipient was listed as someone I didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "It's happening." The confusion washed over me as I tried to recall whether I had ever been in contact with this person. I checked the rest of my inbox, searching for any signs of previous communication, but there was nothing. The email seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, with no trace of how it had gotten there or who had sent it. I reread the draft, wondering if it was some kind of mistake, but the message itself only deepened my unease. The body of the email was short, barely more than a few lines. It simply said, "You need to get out. They know." I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. Who was they? And what did I need to get out of? The ambiguity made my stomach churn. I couldn't figure out if this was some kind of cryptic message, a prank, or something more serious. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but no answers came. I hovered my cursor over the reply button, tempted to respond and ask who the message was from. But a part of me hesitated. What if this was something more sinister? What if responding to the email would only draw unwanted attention to me? The thought made my skin crawl, and I decided against replying. But that didn't make the sense of dread go away. I scrolled through my email account, hoping to find some sign of who might have sent it. I checked the sent items, but there was nothing there. My outbox was completely empty, and I couldn't find any records of this draft being saved or created at any time. It was as though the email had appeared from thin air. I felt a rising panic in my chest, but I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was probably some kind of glitch. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. How could an email just appear like that? Who was the mysterious recipient? And why did it feel so urgent, as though I were supposed to understand something that I didn't? The phrase "they know" echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though nothing seemed out of the ordinary in my physical surroundings. I considered deleting the email, but a part of me wondered if that was the right thing to do.